Okay, looks like we're live again for another debate on Kevin's channel. I believe they're going to be debating, I didn't have the exact question, one of them can state it, I guess, but it's basically about unions. Should we have a greater amount of unionized labor in the economy? That was the question, or something similar to that. So I'm not sure, did you guys say yes or no to opening statements, or just get right into it?
I mean, I guess we could have opening statements if you want.
Yeah, we can go with opening statements.
Okay, all right. Yeah, we'll just do the 3-minute ones, not like a hard or fast time.
Exactly.
I'll let you know if you go over 3 minutes in the private chat. So
Okay.
I guess if you want to start, Ray.
Me? Well, I mean, I wasn't the one making the original proposition.
Oh.
I mean,
Okay, well, Kevin can make it. I thought you were for some reason. Usually it's always the other person on Kevin's channel.
Yeah, no, usually it's the other way around. Usually it's the other way around, but Ray and I did a stream about a week ago or so, right up before the MMI debate, and we got on talking about unions a little bit, and I was like, oh, that could be an interesting topic for a debate in the future. I don't normally challenge people to debates or anything, but I thought it would be an interesting sort of question. So I guess I'll go first then with opening statements. That makes sense. So my view of it in general is that I call myself an anti-syndicalist. I think that syndicalism in general is obviously, counter to capitalism at large. I think that when it comes to labor unionism as a general movement, though, I personally have more apprehension towards unions in the private sector than in the public sector. And I think that one of the issues that we see is that unions in general tend to prioritize and privilege seniority over innovation in general, and that as it comes to a company's bottom line, it can actually be a critical problem, because if you got a company with a relatively low margin and now you've got a union sprouting up in it, it can render the company either unprofitable or compromise its profitability in the long term. And in that sense, I view some of these third-party unions as actually anti-worker, because they tend to be more concerned with getting one up over the management or the corporation rather than the long-term viability of the company. And I think that as far as this debate goes and everything, it could be an interesting opportunity to come to some sort of synthesis over what could improve, efficiency and everything in the economy. Because I think that, in general, it's not so much the issue that, the second a company has a union, it's immediately going to become unprofitable or anything like that. It's just that there's an issue where if you're founding a company and everything, and you've got everything planned out, and then all of a sudden you wind up having a union spread up out of nowhere, that can completely undermine and alter your business model to a point that it might make it so that you're unprofitable. And so that's really all I got to say on that. I think that public unions are a bit different. That's more of like a social contract thing that the whole country can either agree to have or not have. But for me, it's more about the private property aspect of it, and specifically around, we could look at the auto workers unions, for example, in Detroit, where the interest isn't even in the long-term viability of a company. It's on, these short-term demands that take no consideration into, are people still going to even be employed in 5 years, or is it just about like a power grab, that sort of thing. So.
All right. Well, I guess if you want to go ahead, Ray.
Yeah. I mean, I understand some of the concerns that Kevin has about these issues. So, I mean, I'll actually be touching on some of these in the opening statement. Not comprehensively, but I'm assuming that when we get into the conversation, we'll have the conversation. There's probably a lot that we'll have to agree on, and perhaps some things we'll disagree on. But I mean, I'm anticipating this is probably going to be the shortest and most peaceful debate that Kevin has had in quite a while. So,
yeah.
Right. So, I mean, most of my argument is going to hinge on the voice effect. So keep that one in mind, the voice effect in combination with efficient bargaining effect. So basically what I'm going with is the effects for large firms and the effect with firms that have no unions whatsoever in terms of like the economic gains of having a union are smaller than it is for, let's say, slightly smaller. Okay, so it changes the effect of having a union changes depending on what kind of business you are. So if you're like a medium-sized business, the effect might be quite pronounced compared to like if you're a larger business, one is more able to shoulder having to actually give out the union premium. And by union premium, we mean the extra 15% or so in wages that it ends up being paid to people who are members of unions as opposed to those who are not. Productivity effects. I mean, people often like to argue that unions decrease productivity. This, according to the studies that I have sort of osmosed over the last week, because obviously you've always got to keep up to date to make sure that you're not operating on sort of ideas that are not correct. So I went looking around. Turns out that actually the productivity does increase, and wages also increase. So it's one of those things where I don't understand how these negative viewpoints have gained such currency, given that all of the data seems to point in the opposite direction. One thing that I would say that people on the pro-union side actually do not understand is they seem to think that having more people in the union is infinitely good, regardless of what level of unionization already exists. However, it seems that the mechanism works slightly differently from this. It's that there is a threshold past which unionization ceases to have an effect, and that is the threshold at which formal channels of influence have been established and systems of bargaining have been created. So when you have institutions of bargaining that are created as a consequence of unionization reaching a certain threshold, once that threshold has been reached, then further unionization then becomes apparently unnecessary because the voice has been established and they were able to speak on behalf of the workers. So let's say hypothetically, and I'm just plucking this number out of the air, but let's say hypothetically that threshold happened to be 54% within a particular industry, and I've just made that number up, okay? So because it's going to be different for each industry, but sort of unionization past 54% in such a context would then be effectively meaningless. Not that it would be bad to have more people join the union, but it is not necessary to have exactly 100% of people in unions in order for there to be a positive effect on economic growth and wage growth. The channels of influence that are established once that threshold has been crossed are a vital thing that has to be maintained in order to make sure that workers have enough of the wage share to be able to efficiently drive consumption. This is part of something that people often don't consider as well, which is that the effect of union workers being paid more is not strictly negative in terms of in terms of economic gains, because of the fact that, of course, the people who receive these extra wages will spend them in consumption, which again drives economic growth. The shift away from unionization since the 1980s and 1990s has actually come at a cost, and I'm going to use the United Kingdom as an example here. So apparently, the loss of output from falling wage share in the UK is significant. For every 1% increase in the share of profits in national income, the GDP is reduced by 0.13%. And when I say share of profits, I mean profits versus wage share in this case, where wealth is being shifted away from workers and toward the executives, the owners. So that's £2.21 billion if you use the UK's GDP for that. So any positive effects from greater transfer of resources to the owners of capital, appearing both as an insignificant impact on investment and a mild impact on foreign exports, are more than offset by the falling consumption expenditure. The decline in the wage share of national income in the UK from a peak of 76% in 1975 to 67% in 2014 has reduced overall economic growth, and it has been a sliding union authority, best seen through a sliding union density, that accounts for a slide in wage share by up to 9.3%. So how do you solve this problem? And of course, I think it's right that we're talking about this during the coronavirus pandemic as well, because of the fact that obviously the economy has taken a tremendous hit, and there's going to be a need to boost growth and to fight inequality after the pandemic is over. So I mean, I would say to boost growth and reduce productivity, policy should focus on supporting and sustaining responsible trade unionism. The government, and I'm speaking for the UK here, but I'm assuming this will also apply in the UK, to the US to some extent. The government can set a lead on this. They can remove the 1% cap on pay increases in the public sector. They can restore collective bargaining where it was undermined. And all of the legal restrictions placed against trade unions in the UK that have had a detrimental impact on economic growth can be removed. De-restricting union activities, most notably.
You're up to about 5 minutes now.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give Kevin bonus time afterwards.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, I'm just saying, I don't know. I was just letting you know.
I'm almost at the end of my statement, so. De-restricting the union activities, most notably allowing them a greater capacity to organize and act in defense of their members, would promote union membership and have a positive impact on economic growth because it would bring them closer to that threshold. Now I'm just going to quickly address the union leaders making bad decisions part, although I'm sure that in the conversation that follows it's going to be addressed a lot. At low density, I would expect that union leaders will start making bad decisions because they represent a smaller proportion of the population. And therefore, they're going to want to maximize the benefit to the very small number of members that they have comparatively, which will lead to them doing things that we perceive by everyone else as quite selfish. So I would say that the solution to that problem is not to, quote, abolish unions or to further restrict unions or anything like that. And I'm not saying that Kevin is arguing for that. I'm just saying that some people do. In fact, it would be the opposite, which is that in order to get union leaders to stop being sometimes the bad guys, if you expanded their union membership to the point where they represented the majority, then you would end up in a situation where they would be less likely to make exclusivist and selfish decisions because they'd be representing more people. And by representing more people, we mean not just at the company level, but on a sectoral level, because it seems that when you have people being represented on a sectoral level, you end up with less selfish decisions being made. So I think, yeah, that's pretty much where I'm going to draw the line under my opening statements, if you want to call it that.
Okay. Right. So I guess there's a lot there to go over. I would say one that, you know, when we're looking at this, you mentioned how that an increase in unionization as a percentage of the economy resulted in higher productivity at large. I believe you made that point, if I recall. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's something that altogether you're saying, I guess, the United Kingdom in that case. I mean, in the United States, for example, it's been a little bit different, where the United States has actually had quite a bit significant economic growth since Reagan came in and did a lot of reforms that in the time since resulted in a lower percentage of unionized labor in the United States. But I mean, I'm just looking at one article from the Toronto Star that was talking about how, you know, this is from 2019, where General Motors profits actually wound up falling 7% as a result of basically strikes that resulted in cutting production. And so there's the strike effect too that can result in obviously lost productivity and everything too. But I think that one thing to bear in mind, though, is that you mentioned that that some of the negative externalities of it would be heightened if unions comprise a lower percent of the economy versus if they comprise a higher percentage of the economy or larger percentage of the economy. I'm not sure to the extent that I would necessarily agree with that. I think it depends on the resilience of companies, though. I mean, I think that both of us could probably understand that if a business of, say, 500 people now all of a sudden becomes unionized, that could actually bring the company down, or at least put it in danger of not being profitable anymore. I think one of the issues is that it does serve to disincentivize corporate creation, I think. I mean, when you're talking about like in the case of GM there, where only 2 weeks of a strike resulted in them losing basically half of their profits for the quarter out of just 2 weeks. That's kind of a substantial sort of detriment. And like, I'm not saying like that you should ban unions or anything. I'm just saying that I can understand why companies would be very hesitant to be down with unions. I mean, like I used the example of the Young Turks before because they're a really progressive outlet, and even their CEO, Cenk Uygur, he was like, "Oh no, we can't do a union here. We're a small business and everything." And so, even though they're not really a small business, there's kind of that understanding that it would take them into the red, basically.
Well, I mean, in some of these instances, I mean, I'll address them in reverse order, I guess. So, I mean, the Jenk hypocrisy thing, I mean, yeah, that is pretty funny because obviously he is consistently arguing for political stances that would seem to indicate that he is in favor of unionization. But then, of course, when it arrives at his own company, he behaves in a very strange way. So, I mean, I do accept that in some of these cases, like for instance, the extremely small business and so on, they may have their own reasons for having this internal conflict over whether they should permit employees to unionize, et cetera, right? So there is that. But I mean, that's one of those things where how can we say it? The economy is sometimes messy, and people have to work have to work some of these things out. On the issue of the GM one, I mean, well, I have to sort of resist laughing at GM sometimes because of the kind of messes they get themselves into. But I mean, I do not know. I do not know the complete specifics behind why that arrived at a strike situation. But I wonder if there's a lack of mediation going on there, which ought to actually exist. Like to complete the story, Kevin. I mean, was there anyone kind of mediating between the two sides there, or was it basically just a free for all?
Well, it was basically you had 49,000 workers against the corporate level. They took them on strike for 2 weeks, and it brought the profit. Well, it took them down 50% in terms of their quarterly profits. They were still profitable in that case. It's just it's that sort of thing that can disincentivize new companies from getting involved in the market if they're worried that sort of thing can happen, basically. But as far as what
was the union stated reason for why they had that strike?
That specific strike, let's see here. Basically, well, GM was doing basically in that case they had done some plant closures, and that's what basically had led up to it. And basically the idea being that they were going to increase their profitability and everything by closing plants down that weren't productive anymore. And so that's essentially what wound up triggering it. But again, it's the sort of thing that it's like if you've got a private company though, I guess the issue for me is like at what point does the sort of the union effect come in to like undermine private autonomy in that case? Like, because my issue isn't really with public sector unions; it's with private company unions. Basically, at that point, where at some point a company, like they can't necessarily keep stuff running if it's not profitable because their job is to try to make profits, and obviously it's the union representatives' jobs to maximize wages, and so obviously they're going to oppose that. But at some point, if it is a public or if it's a private company, rather, how much autonomy should they really be given to make those sorts of decisions? Because obviously people are going to lose their jobs in that. But if you don't close down unprofitable operations, then your company won't be able to exist in the long run. That's the issue. So
exactly, yes. So I mean, I understand obviously, the need for that. And so, okay, would you agree that in cases like that, where the two sides have completely intractable and opposing interests, that this is precisely why there should be sectoral bargaining and why there should be business federations mediated by the state? Where there can be a decision made as to like who is right and who is wrong in that situation by impartial third parties.
Yeah, that's something that's interesting. I know you mentioned in the last time that we spoke that you were talking about tripartite and negotiations and everything. That's, I mean, you mentioned the case of South Korea. I don't actually know too much about how it operates in South Korea. But I know that like in the United States and for example, you'll often have it basically just be you've got the union, then you've got the corporate representatives, and if they don't reach a decision, then they go to a strike basically. But in the case of South Korea, do you tend to have strikes or does it avoid that point
sometimes
because of negotiation?
It depends on the time period you're talking about because they have a tumultuous history regarding that as well. And so sometimes you end up with very unintended consequences, and other times it goes very smoothly. So an example of it going smoothly would be, cases during, have I got the time period right? I think it's the 1990s, late 1980s, maybe early 1990s, mid 1990s, where unions would make a series of demands. They would get escalated to the point where the state is between doing mediation, and then what would happen is that once it reaches the point where the business owners know that they're not going to be able to get their way on the particular thing, they would essentially just back out of the negotiation process as the government makes a decision in union's favor. However, there are also other cases in which it has been escalated up to the top, and the state simply refused to give the union leaders what they wanted in a particular case, and the refusal of the companies to actually engage in the arbitration was actually turned out to ironically be good for them because of the fact that they just refused to speak. So it then became a conversation simply between the government and the union workers. That happened like a lot, where it was regarded as a system being, quote, not operating in the way that it was supposed to operate, and yet it still delivered relatively not bad results, right? In cases where it operated correctly, obviously both parties would sit down and they would have the conversation. The state would then be mediating between them, and they would reach a mutually acceptable decision between the lot of them. And then there are obviously the instances in which reaching a decision became impossible despite the mediation, and then people went on strike or people got fired or something like that happened. But again, as always, the system is kind of messy. But I think the overall imbalance, South Korea's system has not delivered like waves of wildcat strikes. Like, you don't hear about that happening very often. And this is despite the fact that like many of the CEOs in South Korea are not actually union friendly, despite the presence of unions in their company. So it's not like there is this sort of everlasting love between the two sides. It's just that they managed to not engage in directly confrontational fighting.
Yeah,
I mean, take for example the CEO of Samsung. I mean, the CEO of Samsung is a sorry, not the CEO of Samsung, the founder of Samsung is a guy who declared that he never wanted unions to exist anywhere in the vicinity of his company, and yet Samsung is of course unionized, right? So,
right.
It's one of those things where, despite their apprehension toward it, in fact, perhaps you could even argue that the apprehension of the two sides toward each other is precisely what necessitated the creation of a tripartite system and the creation of these institutions once unionization reached a threshold where it became impossible for the state and capital to ignore their demands. But it's always, this is why I emphasized at the beginning as well, it's always about making sure those institutions come into existence, because if the two sides exist and are fighting each other, but there are no institutions to manage that fighting, then it results in a lot of chaos, I think.
Yeah, no, that is an interesting way of bringing about some sort of resolution there. I mean, I think that it would have to be something where obviously the heads of that sort of impartial body have obviously experience in that sector, so they understand. Right.
So they understand why it is that they're being asked to do whatever. Because otherwise, if you have like, let's say you have the institution being headed up by representatives literally of labor, then of course they're going to decide in favor of labor every single time, which would of course defeat the purpose of it. Similarly, if the people who are responsible for heading up the institution are coming out of a revolving door where they've actually worked in the industry and have been like a CEO of the thing that is being arbitrated, then obviously that would also be a conflict of interest, right? So you would obviously need to make sure that these are what's the word for it? A non-governmental institution, or at least an independent institution of some sort. Let's phrase it that way, so that you don't end up with literal cronyism going on. Right.
Yeah. No, I think that I could get behind something like that. Have it where every sector has that sort of tripartite convention and sort of established, because like, in the United States, when you do have unions, oftentimes it does give rise to a lot of strikes and everything. And I mean, strikes happen in Canada too. I think in the case of with the United Auto Workers Union, that sort of thing, they've had a lot of big strikes that have really hurt the profitability of some of those companies. I think having a sort of an independent body like that could be a good positive sort of step. I guess the question
I'm not saying
would
it's
be,
a magic bullet, of course, because it will have its problems. Just it will be less bad than the thing you presently have.
yeah. I guess the sort of idea then would be how to go about establishing something like that then, so that it would have to essentially be neutral and not obviously biased towards labor movements or towards a corporation. It would be. I would think it would be something that would be rather difficult to really set up nationwide in the United States specifically. But
you'd have to have someone. It's one of those things where perhaps a particular moment has to exist in history in order for that to happen, which is that you would have to have a government which is centrist, i.e., it is not one that is literally backed by one of the two sides directly. To the extent where lobbyists from one of the two sides are in control of those who are actually not in control, because that's really not a very good way of phrasing it, who have undue influence. So neither of the two sides should have undue influence over the people who are coming to that decision. I don't know how you would go about deliberately manufacturing that kind of situation in the US, because simply increasing union density will not lead to that decision being made. Nor would reducing it, of course, because obviously if you reduce it, then you're just essentially making it so that capital has the largest amount of power. But simply increasing union density might not necessarily produce that effect either, because they may or may not end up incentivizing national leaders to create those institutions. If we look at the Democratic Party right now, for example, and I mean the Democratic Party as it is in office at the moment with Joseph Biden as the president of the United States, I don't know whether it would cross the minds of the Biden administration that something like that needs to happen in their economic stimulus plan. Because I've looked at their what they're talking about in terms of economic stimulus, and none of them seem to have actually mentioned organized labor in any context. Right? Someone correct me if I'm wrong, or if you or anyone in the chat, obviously correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I don't think I've actually seen them mention it, meaning that they're not even thinking of that.
Well, Biden did mention that he wanted more union jobs to come back in the Rust Belt, and he did pass an executive order recently that has required the government to prioritize things that are produced in the United States when they're purchasing stuff, basically. But that's more of like a broader level of protectionism. He didn't
literally make it he didn't literally make it like one of the cornerstones of the economic rebuilding, where he's not like making that like a pet project of his. So the thing is, I don't know how you would go about actually like raising that to their attention, because of course, how do you get the ear of the Biden administration? I don't actually know, right? But it'd be one of those things where someone would need to suggest it to them in some context. I don't know which activist would have to do that, but someone will have to suggest it to them in some context that maybe there actually needs to be an institution, because so far there doesn't seem to be one.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I wouldn't actually be opposed to that or anything. I think one of the main issues that I've had in terms of unionization at large is that it tends to discourage new companies from forming, and to essentially result in loss of profits that become unexpected when you have strikes. And so if something like this was able to avert strikes from happening, or at least greatly reduce the chances of strikes happening, I think that would be a good compromise, I think. And obviously South Korea's economy is doing pretty well, despite, the thing that's a bit different though with the South Korean economy, and I need to do more research on this, but to my understanding is that in some of those huge conglomerates their business models don't even take profitability into consideration, because they get propped up by the government basically. But that's at least what I've basically read about South Korea and how their systems work, is that they're directly sponsored by the government, because
the subsidies effect. That's also something that is measurable. So, one concession, a concession I'll make to you on this, which is a criticism I've seen of this before, which is probably true, is that it is noticed that if there is a case where the state is providing some form of subsidy, be it via literally giving companies money, or via arranging the economy in such a way that those particular companies find it easier to become profitable. So whether that involves literally helping the company or structuring things in a way that the company finds to be conducive to their profitability, then unionization tends to go more smoothly because of the fact that they know that they cannot be that they will not be allowed to be harmed to such an extent that they would actually fail, right? So yes, I would say that there is that as well, which is that capital tends to feel more secure in allowing union flourishing when they know that there's a backstop called the state, which is going to prevent them from becoming a failure later on if anything should actually happen to go wrong. However, of course, this becomes like a kind of a circular situation, because of course, whose money is the state using in order to carry out said subsidy? So
no, I get that. I just mean, like, in the US has done this too. I mean, obviously the United States and Canada bailed out the auto workers back in the 2008 recession. I think it was something like $40 billion between Obama and Harper that went into that. I think it was in 2009 when that happened. But the thing is, though, in that case, that was kind of like a one-off sort of thing. What I've read about, like, the large sort of chaebol in South Korea is that they're considered too big to fail as an institution, basically. Like that. It's kind of almost what Wall Street has in the United States, but at a much larger sort of conglomerate level than just simply financial companies. I mean, Samsung, Hyundai, those kinds of companies, they do a ton of stuff. They don't just make like cars or electronics. Like within South Korea, like if you work there, almost everything that you do is made by the company, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, almost everything. You can just kind of like throw a rock and you'll hit something that one of the conglomerates has been responsible for creating or operating or doing. In a sense, I mean, obviously, this is why South Korea is always kind of a weird comparison, because they do have a very, what's the word for it? A lopsided economy, in the sense that they have a small number of companies who do a great number of things.
Yeah,
without which the entire country would simply not exist.
I would kind of call it an not necessarily an oligarchy. I would say it's an anti-competitive market system. I mean, because if you're a small company that's going to sprout up there in any of those industries, how are you really going to compete with Samsung or something? I mean, like, there's
you end up becoming their supplier, basically. You end up becoming their supplier. That's what happens.
That's the thing. That's the thing. And so, in that system, though, I think the problem with applying that model to the United States, though, is that in the United States there isn't that sense that, well, if you do go unprofitable or whatever, the government's going to have your back. Obviously, the U.S. government did bail out some firms in the financial crisis, but they also let Lehman Brothers fail, for example. They also let a lot of non-finance and non-auto worker jobs go down. I think the only reason, honestly, that the auto workers, that GM and et cetera, were actually bailed out was primarily for optics reasons. Personally, I think that the focus of the government in that case was actually more or less just on the financial sector more than anything else. But in that case, if you don't have a guarantee that the government's going to bail you out or whatever, then I could see the negotiations still being more tense than they might be in South Korea, where even if the corporate level loses out, they know that the government's still going to be there as a sort of stopgap or whatever. And so in the United States, in order for it to work, I think there would have to be something where you'd have to have like some understanding that no matter what the result of the negotiations are, they can't bring the profitability under a certain threshold, whether it's like, say, 5% or whatever. Like, the company still has to be profitable in any given quarter.
So essentially have someone do some econometrics on it, basically, and present it as like facts and figures. Like, you can have X amount, but you can't like compromise the integrity of the company.
Yeah, because I get why
I can understand that.
I get why people would be opposed to companies shutting down factories. Like, you have the more sort of socialist people that talk about that as if it's an assault on the working class. The problem is if you keep unprofitable factories open, eventually you're not going to have a company anymore, and then everybody loses their jobs at large. And so, but I'm totally down with having like an institutionalized tripartite system in every sector.
Also,
just,
the negotiation.
yeah.
No, I'll let you finish. No, go on.
Well, it's just that if the government's only really going to bail out the financial sector consistently, though, then they would be the only sector where this would probably not still be a very tense process, I would think, because
but it's unlikely that people working in financials actually want to be part of a union. So that's ironic.
That's true too. But I mean, I think that they would have the easiest time of it, because even if the labor side of it, say at Goldman Sachs won out over the management level, they're still, even if they went into unprofitability, the government's almost certainly going to bail them out because they're seen as too big to fail. Whereas in the South Korean economy, it's like every big company there is just considered too big to fail, which isn't true in the US. Like, they let a lot of firms go bankrupt in 2008 and 2009, right? But or South Korea, I don't think would ever let Samsung go bankrupt no matter what. But
I mean, true facts there. I mean, the other thing that I was going to add as well is that on the union thing, people keep forgetting as well. I mean, both of us in this case, because I think neither of us have mentioned it, although it's in my notes, which is that I'm supposed to mention that one of the benefits of unionization is not directly connected to rises in wages, but rather securing benefits that have already been guaranteed by the government, because of the fact that obviously the organized labor movement is capable of understanding its rights and therefore using them adequately. So say, for example, you were talking about factory closures just now, which I guess for workers are bad, but maybe necessary for the survival of a company given other factors.
I was just kind of talking about it in the same sense as when I talk about the minimum wage argument, where it's like, I know we mentioned in the last one, the last conversation we had, where there were studies looking at fast food minimum wage workers in, I believe it was New York and New Jersey, and they found that, for even a small 1% increase in the minimum wage, it resulted in 1 out of 400 workers losing their jobs. And it's like, if you're still there, you're better off. But if you're somebody that got laid off as a result of it, you're like infinitely worse off, basically. And it's kind of the same thing here, where it's like, if you're somebody that's still on the payroll after they close the factories, you're better off because the company's going to survive and everything, and they're going to keep going on. If you're somebody that got laid off as a result of it, it's really bad for you. But if they don't lay off anybody and these factories aren't profitable, then eventually everybody's going to be laid off, and then everybody loses their jobs. And so this
is why having social services cover that would probably be a way of actually preventing, or at least assuaging the grievance which they think that has been inflicted on them. So, for example, let's say that workers knew that if their factory gets closed down because they have to downsize it for whatever actual economic reason, right? If they knew the government had a safety net that was capable of catching them, and not the presently existing one in the US that seems to be like you have to like jump through wings of fire or something. I don't know. The way that people describe it sounds quite crazy. But instead of having it like that, have it be like a retraining and reallocation program where they only lose their job for a very limited period of time, and then they are sort of helped into their next one as rapidly as possible. That's in something that's relatively similar to the thing that they just left. You get what I mean? So like, if that was more streamlined, then they wouldn't actually see the need to have such a protest in the first place. What they called the employment protection program, that they called it in Japan or something, which is where every single time unemployment gets above, what is it? It's a magic number. I think it's something like 4.2% or something. Anytime the number rises above that number, the state injects a bunch of funds into various programs and then essentially reallocate people to new stuff. So I heard one, for example, about a guy who supposedly used to work at Toyota or something, and they laid off a bunch of people in some area for whatever reason, and the state apparently showed up with this plan to essentially pay them to relocate to another area, at which they then bought them like new stuff to move to a new location or whatever, and like literally paid for them to move house and so on, and then essentially said, okay, now your new job is there, and they went back to work. So if the United States were to do something like that, then you would probably squash that problem immediately, because then they would have nothing to protest about.
Yeah, well, I think the system that I advocate for in general as a replacement to the welfare system that exists right now in the US and Canada is a negative income tax system. But obviously in this case, this would have to be more robust than that, because what I think of as a negative income tax is like the bare minimum to meet basic expenses, essentially. Nothing like, what somebody is probably, making a middle class income or better. And especially if they're an experienced engineer or something that might get laid off. I think that would be an interesting sort of proposal there. I know that the U.S. has done some like retraining programs and everything to try to move people into different sectors. I've seen mixed results on that. Like when they've tried that in certain states, that it didn't necessarily work out too well. But again, it would depend on how they were structured. I know the last time I looked into that was over a year ago, though. I think it was Wisconsin did one where I think it was. Well, actually, in that case, I think it was specifically like a welfare system where welfare was made conditional on basically job training and seeking out work, and that it had mixed results basically because they were, if I recall correctly, they were basically like they would take your money even if you found a job or something, that essentially your wages would essentially get garnished or something until you made above a certain amount. I forget the specifics.
That's very weird.
But yeah, I think though in the case of what you were talking about with Japan, I'm not sure if I could actually see something like that passing in the United States. I could see something like that. In Canada, there are programs that will relocate people. They're kind of hard to access, but they do exist for industries that are really in demand and everything. But I guess kind of like at a system level to have that sort of thing in place, that could make some sense. It's just the only sort of downside there would be that it would probably be really expensive, though. It'd be the downside. But I know a lot of people would say that's basically like the government paying for something that they would see General Motors in that case should pay for or whatever. But I'm not sure about that one as to how long General Motors would still be responsible for, paying people and whatnot, because they do have severance packages. They do have severance
internal. Yeah, I mean, if it was an internal move, then I guess GM could be made responsible for it. Because another method that I've seen in play is the one where it's called, I can't remember the name for it, but it's the one where the state pays the company to not lay the person off.
Yeah, that's what they did in the UK, if I recall, like during the coronavirus. It wasn't it the case where the government would pay companies.
Yes. That's a furlough payments. But I mean, the furlough payments are different from this, because in the case of furlough payments is basically paying the company to not lay the person off and to keep them in the same position that they're going to have when they come back. Whereas in the case of the thing that I'm talking about they're going to get laid off anyway from the position that they have because the thing is closing down, but the state doesn't want them to actually leave that particular company. So it's essentially paying the company to find them another job in the same company, thus making the company responsible for what's going to happen. So then the company has to decide whether they want to move them to another location and pay them to do that, or whatever choice it has to be made. But the choice is basically you can't lay them off, but you can do anything else. And the state will essentially pay the company to facilitate that process. I mean, that could be a solution in which the private sector gets to be the one making the actual decision, but they're just being essentially encouraged, quote unquote, /subsidized by the state to make that decision in that way.
What would happen though, say for example, like let's just do the GM example, where GM, they have to close a few plants down. So they do that and the government pays them to relocate people elsewhere, but they don't have any productive places that they could essentially put them. I mean, if they're getting paid.
Yeah, in that case, then there's literally no escape. In that case, then they're just laid off. They cannot win.
Because that's the issue, is that some of these companies, they hit hard times basically. And I mean, this one was before the well, I guess it is a financial crisis, but the pandemic, this is before the pandemic happened and everything. They were just closing down those companies or those factories because they weren't productive. But I mean, that does happen with companies though, where even if the company on the whole is still growing, they'll have places that
less places for people. Like maybe they're automating or something. There are a lot of reasons as to why the downsizing will not result in an increase in the number of people ever again. So then there's nowhere for them to put them. I mean, that is a possibility. But in that case, that's where your idea of the negative income tax comes in, because then it just means they are laid off, but they don't have to like go into a gutter, for example, because of the
Or
fact that
that-
your negative income tax idea would be making sure that they actually are still getting paid something.
Yeah, well, I mean, the equivalent that they'd have right now would be like unemployment insurance or welfare, I guess. It would probably be unemployment insurance in that case. But I think, though, that the issue that you run into there is that I think a lot of companies, when they do lay off people, though, if you did give them the money to keep those people on the payroll, they probably wouldn't be able to necessarily allocate them somewhere else that would still generate profits. Otherwise, they'd probably do that on their own, I would imagine.
I mean, if that is the case, then of course they should reject the government's money on that instance. Then, if there's nowhere for them to put them, they can't just sit there taking the government's money forever on that issue, because the government will only do that for a certain period of time, right?
Well, I think they would. I think they would.
They don't have any incentive to claim that they need that money forever. But obviously, the government could then come back in a month and be like, "Have you done anything yet?" And they could be like, "No, we're just enjoying the money." In which case, then the money has to be cut off at that point.
Yeah, no, I think that the money would still go to the workers. They just do make work stuff for them, because managers tend to want to have more employees for their own prestige and don't like necessarily getting rid of people. But even if it's not in a productive sort of enterprise, I think the problem with that
may be possible with one or two people, but I mean, if you're talking about like an entire plant's worth of people have been essentially made redundant, they would never be able to find a way to actually keep that what's the word for it? There's a word for it when a company is taking money from the government and coming up with increasing excuses as to why that money should continue. I've forgotten what the word for that is.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm not even sure. I don't know the exact term for that. It's just, the thing is, the problem there is like...
They would find it hard to do that with like an entire factory of people. So they would not be able to game the system that much.
Because even if they could open up a plant somewhere else that might technically be more profitable, which I couldn't see really working, because you've got all the externalities from that area already. So that'd be the best place to have a plant. But even if they could, nobody's going to compensate them for the billions of dollars in upfront cash that they'd have to put out to build the factory or a new one or something. So, I mean, that's kind of the issue is, I mean, like you
in a lot of cases, I'm not saying it's a magic thing, because I mean, in a lot of cases, the scenario you're describing is absolutely correct. So, like in a lot of cases, there is no saving that particular job, right? So, I mean, in that case, then obviously unemployment insurance or negative income tax in the ideal future would have to be the thing that would pick up then.
Yeah, well, I think in that specific case, you've got a company there that's just not doing as well as it used to do, and they have to lay off people because of that. A lot of companies in different sectors do have that issue, and I'm not sure about how long the government would be able to keep up the political capital to keep that system going. And I don't even really think that a system that's not going to be sustainable should be subsidized in that sense. I'd personally way prefer a negative income tax to that, where people, you know, they basically exit the industry and then go into something else at that point. But I think one thing that would help, just specifically in the case of the auto sector, though, and I've talked about this before on this channel, is I think it's really hard to compete with other countries that are able to make stuff for a lot cheaper. And I actually think that when it comes to something as critical as heavy manufacturing or the auto industry, maybe this is a bit of a hot take, but I wouldn't be opposed to putting tariffs on, say, Japan, for example, to try to spur the US auto factories or Canadian auto factories, because those factories have externalities that if you ever went into a war, you could easily produce, or you could switch them over to producing military equipment in a way that you can't really do with a lot of other sectors. But a lot of people don't like that. Like, that's something that I had debated MMI about.
Isn't that the same thing as just delivering a subsidy, though? Like if you're essentially importing, because I mean, if you're importing a Japanese or Korean car and then like adding a tax to it because it didn't come from the US, then you're essentially helping GM by making sure that the price is the prices of the two vehicles are closer, right? But then, of course, by the same logic, you could just give the money to GM directly.
You could, but I think you could do it to GM directly. But I think one of the differences is that it changes the demand in the market. Whereas if GM has more money available, that doesn't necessarily mean that their cars are going to be in more demand. But if you put a tariff on, say, imports of cars, that would change what people demand for cars and thereby encourage, say, what GM is producing. Because I do think with something as important as, say, auto manufacturing, that you still want to have that done in your country as opposed to buying cheaper cars elsewhere. Because
what about the psychology of it, though? Because the psychology of it, though, is that if you like, let's say, for example, there's a hypothetical president that came out, like, doesn't matter which party it is, because I mean, sometimes Democrats talk about doing this too. But let's say there's a hypothetical president of the US who came out and said that, like, we're going to put a tax on, like, a tariff on any car manufactured by Toyota. Hypothetical, right? And obviously the whole gamut, because you're listing like the entire country. So it'd be like every single car with origin from Japan, they decide they're going to put a tariff on them. I mean, customers are going to realize that is occurring, right? So it may or may not actually alter their buying decision because of the fact that they may end up engendering a narrative of they had to put a tariff on Japanese cars in order to try to encourage you to buy GM cars because you weren't buying them. And then people are going to simply ask, like, why weren't you buying the GM car? And then someone's going to cheekily say something like, because the GM cars are crap, maybe, right? And
I get that.
And then you're going to run into that problem where people are going to still try to actually buy the one that you've tariffed because they think that you're being unfair to the one that you tariffed.
Yeah, no, I get that. I just think that in the current trajectory, the way things are going, I'm not sure if the US is even going to be producing cars in 30 years, because it's very hard to compete with, say, Japan, South Korea, and whatnot. And if you lose your auto manufacturing and everything, then you're at that point, you don't really have that much in the way of manufacturing left. And I don't think that an economy that's mostly all service and white collar work, it transitions to a wartime economy very well. That's kind of the issue, because I do think that we're.
I mean, one of the things that the US could do to try to resolve this problem, though, and obviously, this is going to be a hot take, okay? So people can like quote me on this and laugh about it later if it's completely implausible. But one of the ways that the US could probably save its car industry without having to overtly put a tariff on someone would be, well, obviously all of the preceding. But in addition to that, consider like who else that is not American might want to buy American cars. Like, hypothetically, maybe there are some people who are in Eastern Europe or in Central Asia or whatever who are like just getting onto the ladder of like increasing their consumption, who might actually have a taste for American cars if they were presented with them.
Right.
I don't know whether anyone's ever tried that. Like, I mean, I saw someone who said something quite funny, which caused me to have this thought in the first place, where someone said, what was it? Someone was saying, why is it that Chinese people are so offended by many of the politics of the United States, but that will then still go and actually buy an American car? Right. So, I mean, obviously, I thought that was quite comedic. And you do actually see, like, on Chinese roads, sometimes you do actually see, like, the occasional American car, and you think to yourself, wow, okay, they're buying American cars. Why are they doing that? Right. So I don't think that American cars are like unsaleable outside of the United States, right? There are plenty of countries that have people who will be willing to buy those cars. So you could even actually boost the car industry by basically saying, okay, what if we just exported cars?
Yeah, no,
because
that's
right now it all seems to be about, can you get Americans who live in America to buy American cars? But they might not be the entirety of the the entirety of the customer base that exists for that.
Yeah, no, you're right about China. I know with a lot of the upper echelon in China, for a long time, maybe it's still the case, they really were into Buick, for example. They saw Buick the same way as a lot of people here see, Porsche and well, not Bugatti, but like, what I'm talking about, like upper end cars and everything. Whereas a lot of people here see Buick as just like an average sort of, car. Right. Yeah. Whereas it was kind of seen as a status symbol with the party members and stuff in China. But
also GM had a large presence. I don't know where it is now, because obviously people in the chat are saying that it's getting wrecked in Europe. But GM had like significant presence in Europe at one point. Like, I mean, particularly in the United Kingdom as well. A lot of cars that are basically that people used to think were just like badged as one thing, they were really actually controlled by GM, right? Like, for example, what is that brand? Vauxhall, for example. Wasn't Vauxhall actually GM?
Oh yeah, Vauxhall. Well, I thought that Vauxhall was a UK car, if I remember.
Yeah, but I thought that was owned by GM.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, it is a subsidiary. I'm just looking it up right now as to who actually owns them. It's a British, let's see, sister brand of Opel, and let's see who actually owns them. It just says subsidiary, but it doesn't mention who's their parent is Stellantis, and that's okay. And they are, let's see who owns these guys. Oh no, it looks like that well, I mean, I guess it mentioned here, which was, okay, Stellantis, which was formed by the merger of French automaker Group and Fiat Chrysler Automobiles. Okay. I'm not actually sure. It looks like it's that it's owned by the Netherlands company now, or a Dutch company.
Oh, interesting.
Huh. But yeah, they used to be owned though by General Motors, I guess.
Yeah. So it's obviously changed recently. People in the chat are saying that it changed.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a how do you exactly pronounce that? Peugeot, Citroën, and Fiat Chrysler.
I'm probably pronouncing it incorrectly, but I think the first one is Peugeot. The second one is Citroën.
Citroën. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, they were GM. Okay. Yeah, Vauxhall and Opel are GM. Oh, I know Holden is in Australia was GM. That's right. I know Doug DeMuro reviewed a couple Holden cars. I didn't even know that company existed until a little while ago. But oh, Peugeot. Okay, Peugeot. Gotcha. Interesting.
Yeah, they're saying it's only in the UK that it's pronounced Peugeot.
Peugeot. Okay. Yeah.
I guess we're trying too hard to make it sound French.
Yeah.
Okay. Someone's also pointed out that Holden in Australia was also GM, but not anymore.
Yeah, no, Holden, I'm not even sure. Like, Holden still makes cars, I think.
I don't know. We're almost at an hour. There was one thing I was wondering, is you guys were talking a lot about the unions and the private sector. I was wondering if you think it's kind of a different thing to talk about unions for government employees, like the teachers unions, the police. It's kind of a different subject, I would imagine. Like, there's certain different things you'd have to take into account with those. How do you guys feel about that? Do you think like more sort of government unionization in, I guess, for teachers, police? I can't imagine. I don't think either one of, well, maybe, I don't know if you would be in favor of like military unions. I don't think that would even, in the United States, I don't think that would be possible, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, didn't the Soviet Union try military unions and it didn't really work?
I don't know.
They just went back to the old rank system and everything. But like, yeah, no, I'm just looking here that Holden, they went defunct on the 31st of December of last year. So Holden's done. Wow. Well, yeah, but they were a subsidiary of GM though. But yeah, no, on the public unions thing, that's a bit different. I mean, because now you're not really talking about a profit incentive or anything anymore. But in that case, I mean, my main criticism of police and teachers unions and whatnot is that if you're bad and unproductive, or, you know, especially if you're a cop or something, you're really bad, even if the union knows you're bad, it's still their job to protect you, you know? And so you'd see often in case of police brutality where it'd be the unions that were the biggest defenders of bad cops, you know? So, I mean, I really think it is a different kind of a subject because we're not really talking about how it affects profitability or anything anymore. But I'm not sure on that. I've said before, I think that public unions are less problematic though, because it's not so much of an infringement on like private enterprise or anything, or on, you know, what somebody might start as a company and then all of a sudden, you know, now their bottom line is totally shifted or whatever. I feel like with public unions, it's the sort of thing that it's kind of up for people to decide how they're gonna work, or if they're gonna be a thing or whatnot. I think I think that the biggest problem, though, with teachers unions and police unions in general is just that tendency to privilege seniority, even if it means protecting somebody very bad, over I guess fairness in some sense. I mean, now when the police brutality stuff happened in the summer, the unions didn't really rush to defend Chauvin, for example, because it was so egregious.
So egregious, yeah.
But in general, though, over the last 10 years, when there have been, cases of police brutality that have come to light, they'd be kept on the payroll and the unions would be there to defend them, and it's like, I don't know. I don't know really how I feel about that, because it just seems like all that really matters is seniority, not if you're a good cop or whatever, but how long have you been a cop for?
I mean, a lot of people have criticized police unions for that behavior, but I mean, it's one of those things where it's kind of like, that is the unfortunate negative externality that you get with the system. I mean, from the other angle, you could also see it from the teachers union direction, which is that the state, of course, has an incentive to pay its workers as little as possible so that it can claim that it has reduced the amount of expenditure and saved on taxpayers' money, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, there would need to be someone to argue that, okay, well, don't cut the costs this much, because then you're actually going to produce a negative effect in the sector. Right. So, I mean, even though obviously I understand the negative aspects of public unions, I mean, I can't imagine what it would look like without them. Like, it would probably be worse, just in different ways.
Yeah, I would think that another big difference might be just that for a lot of those public jobs you talk about, they kind of have people advocating for them in organizations out, especially if you're talking about police, military, teachers. Like, there's a lot of people, they kind of view those jobs in a different light than like a private sector. They kind of view them as like a noble profession, sort of. And you can get people that are unaffiliated to like really care about, it was particularly people on the right that would care about police and the military, but basically everyone is, wants, better treatment of teachers and things like that. So it's kind of a political aspect to it gets involved.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the sort of thing, though, is I think that to the extent that there should be reforms in place, there has to be more of a focus, at least when it comes to schools, on how productive you are as a teacher. Because like I know I went to a school that, high school that was unionized and everything, and there were some teachers there that like they were just not passionate about it. They were just there for a paycheck and a pension, basically. And that's kind of a tough one. Whereas if you had a system that more rewarded, I don't know, like grades in a class or something, I'm not exactly sure how you would necessarily structure it or whatnot. But if you had a sort of system that, as opposed to rewarding seniority, rewarded results, that I think that I could produce something better. I know one alternative that's been proposed by people is to say, basically, not subsidize private schools per se, but give people vouchers or whatnot so that they're able to pick different schools that they want to go to as opposed to public schools.
Which would then create some level of competition where it wouldn't just be, okay, they did a thing and you had to accept that thing, which then of course leads to a spiral downward. So no, I mean, I agree with that idea to the extent that obviously it should be done in a way that is obviously fair. So, for example, when people talk about vouchers, the vouchers should not be exclusionary towards certain types of people. The vouchers should not sort of disprivilege other people who are living in different neighborhoods and say, okay, well, you come from this neighborhood, so you're not allowed to have a voucher and stuff like this. Like, obviously, you and me probably agree that should never happen under any circumstance. So,
yeah. Well, one of the problems with it, though, that I've seen is that even if the vouchers are available, though, they tend to be like the same amount of money or whatever. And some people might live like a long way away from a school that's better or whatever. And it means that they have to commute. Like it results in like, I'm not sure how you would design it, though, because I get that, if in cases that I read of people who've gone to private schools, either through vouchers or their parents basically put everything into it, they tended to do better. But it would result in them having to like commute 3 hours away from, typically they get inner city or something. But
yeah, my oversight there, because I'm sure the people watching this back later will be like, yeah, how did Ray not think of the fact that commuting further with your voucher then becomes a sort of an inhibition on being able to actually claim that voucher?
yeah,
It's because for a moment there I actually forgot that American transport infrastructure is like structured in such a way that you can't just like get on a train and arrive in the next location in 4.5 seconds. You know what I mean? Like you have to actually get on the road and actually drive all the way there, right? So yeah, that is one of the big problems. So I mean, assuming that that's not going to change because the topology of the United States makes it so that you can't literally just install bullet trains anywhere you want, and you can't even install, like, in terms of like the bus service and so on, because of the way the US road system is designed. Like, I don't think you'd be able to like do the thing that a lot of left liberals keep fantasizing about doing with public transport. Like, unless someone wants to cut their way through mountains and stuff, I don't know. Because, I mean, am I wrong here? I mean, people in the chat, obviously, or you yourself can tell me if I'm wrong here. On the North American continent, it's logistically difficult, it's logistically difficult to do the kind of thing that they're talking about with public transport, right?
Yeah,
So,
well, I mean, it depends on the scale, though. I mean, typically the issue with this sort of aspect is that the good schools in a city might be, say, 15 kilometers away from where you happen to live or something. It's not exactly a case of trains. It's more an issue of, access to cars or access to, a sufficient bus system. I know where I live, there's a pretty robust bus system and everything, but there isn't really like a big sort of extensive train network in Canada per se. There's a lot of trains and stuff, but it mostly tends to be a east to west sort of
exactly.
where the people are in, like, very close to the border kind of thing. Whereas if you live outside of the furthest south 10% of Canada, there isn't really much in the way of transportation infrastructure. There are roads and stuff, but I think the issue as it relates to schooling, though, is on a much smaller scale than we're talking about trains or anything.
Okay, if you go about it the other way, then what if we flipped the issue the other way and say, okay, we assume that everyone's not going to want to travel far away from where they are to go to places that have better performance statistics. Like, I mean, obviously, right? So I mean, I probably should have thought of that at the beginning. So if we do it the other way around and say, let's import into the public sector best practices that have been observed in the private sector. So, for example, the thing you mentioned, which is ranking teachers based on the results they actually produce in the classes that they teach. Right?
Yeah.
So there's that. So then teachers now have an incentive to adopt best practices instead of sort of just going along to get along. So there's that. And people are going to be more innovative about the ways in which they engage in teaching. The other thing that could be dealt with as well is an end to this thing that exists in the United States where schools are getting their funding from the property taxes in the districts in which they are based.
Right.
Because it means that obviously in poorer districts, they have less property taxes coming out because of the fact that the neighborhoods that they're in have a lower property value in the first place. So one way to avoid this would be the use of what they call block grants, I guess, more prolific use of those in order to do that. But maybe that is politically fraught, or maybe there's some other problem with that. So instead, just change the entire tax system in the terms of the way that it funds schools. Schools should instead be getting all of their funds from basically outlays from the federal government instead of having it being like a local district thing, right? I mean, could we agree on that? That essentially the central government should be the one responsible for collecting the tax and then distributing it to the schools as it is needed. And obviously with the criteria in place where teachers will have to actually, engage in a certain amount of performance in order to get the wage rises and so on, right? You get remunerated more or promoted further when you produce better results in class, and you've got a different and better system. That way, the public school that is quite close to the locations that these people are at would improve their performance. This is a guess, however, because obviously I'm not like a pro in this area. Everything I just said could be totally wrong, but
yeah, I know one of the big criticisms of that in the United States, though, would be that if it's the federal government allocating funding now, then you're going to probably have a more uniform sort of curriculum and everything. And a lot of people would say that they prefer having it be more localized as opposed to having the federal government have, all the jurisdiction over it. What do you make of that argument, though?
I don't know, because I mean, it's one of those things where I mean, there are upsides and downsides. Like maybe the federal government would actually get it wrong, and then everyone would have wrong policies being enacted across the entire country. But I mean, I would suspect that they would notice that pretty quickly. But also at the same time, I would say that in terms of the local government thing, I mean, it'd be weird for them to make that argument if they're making that argument in defense of schools that are already failing, though.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. Like, I think in general in the United States, it's really clear that private schools do better than public schools. But, you know, there are a lot of factors that go into that.
Right. It's kind of a complicated thing because we do have, because I am from the U.S. There are certain federal standards you have to meet, but they're really minimal, and you can end up having states basically like Texas can decide certain standards for other states just through the fact that we're so massive. We order most of the textbooks, so our textbook standards kind of inform what a ton of other states are going to have to teach, because whatever our standards are is what the textbook producers will produce. And then you have other things like New York, and I think other states do this as well. I know New York City does. They have public schools that are screened. They're academically screened. So certain students that perform better go to these schools, and there's huge arguments about, is that fair or not? Because the screened schools are better schools, but it's also that the students have been pre-screened and they're just more intelligent students, and so they feel like they deserve the opportunity to have a higher level curriculum taught to them. They do it kind of in where I live. They have you'll be in the same school, but you'll have different class levels. So there's the standard classes, which are really bad, and then there's they call them AP classes, which are better. They're supposed to be closer to college level. So it's a mixed issue there.
Yeah. Dr. Zayas has a comment in the chat. He says a lot of the money for local schools still ends up coming from the federal government as is. I think Zayas mentioned he lived on the East Coast of the U.S. He says, I remember looking this up at one point. I was shocked at how much federal aid schools get. And so he also says, considering that property taxes are generally very high and most of that goes to schools. So, but it is true that in the U.S. still a lot of the funding for schools is based on the property taxes.
Which is that's the bulk of it, probably.
Yeah, and I don't like that system. I mean, I inevitably in that system, it means that if you live in a poor area, your school is going to be worse than if you live in Beverly Hills or something. And then how much of an equal opportunity system do you really have then, right?
Exactly.
But,
I remember going to the school in the poor area. It was when I was in high school. I went to their elementary school to help them out. And I was kind of shocked, like stunned at how awful this elementary school was. Like how they didn't really have any control over the kids. It was in such a poor condition. And we only had one high school, so everyone went there. But like compared to my elementary school, I was like, this school is horrible. And it probably because it was in the poor part of the city, which also happened to be, it was basically the old, it was an elementary school, but it was the old black high school from when they had segregation. It's the same building. So it's like you also have this segregated issue where, the poor part of town was still, it's not officially segregated or anything, but it still kind of is.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess to kind of bring it back to, reform and everything, though, I think that there's definitely a problem, though, when you've got a system that essentially does reward seniority or simply being on the payroll over results. And I'm not sure how much of a reform you could do to that wouldn't meet like extreme resistance from the unions that are already in place. Like I know if that sort of thing was tried in Canada, for example, the teachers unions would probably strike if you tried to change it so that you get your compensation or something based on how productive your class is, Am I having an audio issue on my end?
No.
Okay.
I was just waiting to see if you were going to finish that thought or whether that was actually the end of it.
Yeah, no, I don't really have too much else to add, actually. So
fair enough. I mean, obviously, we mostly agree on this particular issue then.
Yeah. I don't really think that there's much else that I think it's kind of relevant to debate here. If Henry had any questions, feel free. But
Henry?
wait, did we lose Henry now? Okay.
No, I didn't. I actually just stepped away for a second. But
okay.
You said I didn't have any more questions. That was really the only one regarding unions was about the public sector. So.
Oh yes, because that's what this was tying back to, which is basically public sector unions and what the negative and positive aspects of them are. Like, I mean, it would be very nice if perhaps public sector unions would raise some of these. Well, I mean, they're probably doing that already. So, but yeah, I mean, obviously, I do understand the issues that people have with public sector unions, particularly the one with the police, for example. Because I've seen a lot of people writing negative things about police unions. I totally get it. It's one of those things where it's the unfortunate aspect of it is that sometimes public sector unions will do things that people will look at and think, why would you do that? But I mean, it's very similar to how, even the worst people have a right to a lawyer. So if someone is accused of police brutality, for example, and they may indeed be an abusive policeman, then perhaps it's just part of the process that they would get defended by their union up to the point where it is no longer possible to do so because they have been determined to be guilty of the thing that they did.
Right. I guess my question would be, then, because with the police thing, I don't know how personally I would feel about that, but like I think, would you guys agree that there's certain things, specifically like the military, that it would you could not allow them to unionize? Like you couldn't allow for like just pragmatic reasons in there, because it's,
I suppose,
illegal for them to refuse lawful orders and things like that, or just illegal for them to quit their jobs, really, for an arbitrary reason.
You can't have the military striking, that kind of thing.
That's impossible. Yeah, the military is one place where I can never imagine union policies taking off at all.
But here's what I would say about that, though, which is I guess a bit of maybe a bit of a hot take or something, which is that I think that the military should basically, by I guess almost like a sort of a constitutional thing or something, be paid way higher than they're currently paid. I think that I'm for raising defense spending across the board, but I also think that the idea that U.S. soldiers start out at something like $20,000 a year at the entry level enlisted, I think it's something around $20,000 a year is kind of crazy.
That's true, but just to make the point that it's $20,000 a year, but they have essentially no expenses because the benefits are very good as well. So they're, if you're private joining at 20 grand, that's almost all free money because you're being provided housing, food, medical services, dental. The only things you would really need to pay for would be like, I don't know, your cell phone bill, your car.
Okay.
So it's
that's a good point you're making there as well.
And you've got really great benefits like the GI Bill after you get out, where most people go in debt when they go to school. I actually made money going to school, so there's really, really good benefits in the U.S. military. It's so
I mean, in that sense, what the U.S. military has currently is probably comparable or better than what a lot of like teachers unions have and stuff in terms of benefits in that sense. If you were to do it as a career.
Sort of something I was bringing up is that I'm not even sure, specifically for the military, they have so many advocates already that I don't know that a union would even necessarily be necessary. And teachers and police, I don't know. It just feels like it's a totally different subject almost from the public economic arguments you guys were having before.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was also going to say the military also is a very good advocate for itself as well. If you went to the Pentagon and were like, guys, you got this idea that involves you having more money, they're not going to look at you and be like, really? We're not about that. They're totally about that, right? So I think at that point, the easiest thing ever is to convince them to spend more money on their own soldiers.
Well, yeah, I think I think the military in general. I mean, people talk about how the U.S. military gets a ton of money and all this, and it's like so much money and everything. And in reality, the U.S. military is only about 2.5% of the U.S. GDP. like a lot of people look at it and say like, oh, it's a very big number, but then the U.S. economy is a massive number. So
Exactly.
like this idea, like you'll hear from people like Kyle Kalinske and stuff that half of America's money goes to wars, for example, which is so goofy, right?
Yeah, that's a number that doesn't make any sense at all. I think it's because people start confusing the share of the budget with the actual GDP of the country.
Yeah, they confused the discretionary budget because Reese went through the numbers on it, and he found that as far as actual combat spending as a percent of the government's expenditure in a given year, it was like less than 1% went to combat operations. You know, this idea that's 50%. It's like, no, it's 50% of discretionary spending goes to the military. And of that, a ton of that goes to wages, equipment, procurement, maintenance, and base maintenance. Hardly any of that actually goes to combat operations within that. It's like a really small number, you know, but yeah. But yeah, I don't like what sort of, I guess like the sort of argument for having a union in a company or in an industry is this idea of having representation or having, you know, a voice or whatnot. But in the military specifically, though, like part of the contract with the military is that, like what Henry was saying, is that you have to follow lawful orders from superiors, right? Like, I mean, it's true in a company too. You have to do what your boss says, but it's like a way more institutionalized.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, this is why I would say that obviously a union inside the military is literally impossible, particularly since you know what you're getting into when you join, which is that you're going to obey orders that are handed down to you from above. And that is how it is, right? So no, I would not say that unions should exist in the military. That would be impossible. I mean, obviously, I can't think of any military on planet Earth actually that doesn't have the basic agreement being that people who are above you will give you orders and then you will execute them.
They essentially sign away certain rights, basically, when you're doing that. But it's so that one, and I didn't think either of you would be in favor of that. That's just the most obvious place where neither of you, I think, would think that a union was appropriate. Would there be anything else? In a private sector, I don't know if either of you would think that. Maybe public sector, but is there anywhere else you would think a union might just be infeasible or inappropriate?
I guess that's a good question.
Police might be the next one, but it seemed like you're both kind of okay with the police.
Well, I have a lot of problems.
I don't like it, but I think they should still be able to.
Yeah, I've got a lot of problems with the way that police unions operate. Like I've said before, that like I would probably want to get rid of them, but it is a good point that Ray makes, though, about how, you know, even a murderer has a right to an attorney and stuff, and that, you know, if they're there to advocate for people. It's just I think the main issue too for me is that it's more of a focus on seniority rather than, you know, results in general. And that's a bit different with policing as far as how you would measure results and stuff. But as far as other industries that you can't really have any sort of union in, the only other one that's kind of as critical as the military, I would think, would be like what people think of as like the military industrial complex, stuff like Lockheed or whatever, where like if you had a strike on producing military equipment, even if it's not really the military, that could be a threat to national security, you know. But I'm not sure if Lockheed's actually unionized. I don't think they are. Henry, do you know if any of these military contractors are unionized?
I would not. I don't know. I would be kind of surprised if they were, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. Because I just feel like, you know, military contractors would be the other one where having that unionized could be really problematic from a security standpoint. But
yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of the situation on that either, but I would not expect that unionization levels are high in that sector at all.
Yeah.
I mean, especially since there. Let me put it this way: there'd be rather little for people to complain about, or in the first place, for them to have to be incentivized to create such institutions, because the kind of people who work in defense contractors anyway are usually getting remunerated at a level where they don't feel a need to band together in order to have sort of a contention with management.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, not all defense contractors make like big money and everything,
but enough that they wouldn't have the same pressure to do so. And if they did have something that they wanted to like come together and bring to management, they wouldn't need a union structure to do it. They just do it themselves anyway. They just get together and have like a what's how would it be phrased? A very adversarial brunch.
Yeah, like Lockheed's average salary is 101K American dollars, which is insane. Like, I mean, but I mean, obviously there are cops and stuff that can make that kind of money too, but depending on, you know, their compensation structure and everything. But that's the average for the company as a whole, so that's pretty good. That's but I would say, just in general, on a theoretical level and everything, I would say defense contractors also should probably not allow to unionize. But you're right in the sense that they probably wouldn't have reason to. But you could imagine a strike at Lockheed, if it ever did happen, would be a problem for national security. But yeah.
Well, I guess a question might be, Kevin, if you're against, well, I don't know if you are against, but like, say you were against certain unions and certain companies, like, is there even like a feasible or like ethical way to restrict it? Like, would it be just that the company, I don't know, could just fire anyone that tries to unionize, or like how would you even stop people from doing it if they wanted to? I guess would be the question.
I guess that's the thing, is that the only way that you could really do it would be that you as a company, you can have co-ops and everything, but if you had a company that, you know, it's a private company and everything, and there was an attempt at unionization, I personally don't see necessarily an issue with the company deciding to fire people over that. Like, I know Walmart's done that in the past before and everything. I don't know. I guess that's kind of a hot take or whatever. But I think that, again, if you got a company with a really low margin or whatnot, that can be really destructive in the long run in terms of sustainability of the company even existing. But again, if there was an institutionalized tripartite level that Ray was talking about, that would change things, especially like in the U.S. and everything. But it's a good point to say, well, how would you prevent it? I think the only way that you could really prevent it is to give companies the right to like just basically fire people for trying to unionize or something. I know some people, like I know MMI argued that you should send the military in if people try to unionize. So, yeah, obviously I don't support that or anything. I just I think that in some of these companies, like say a 7-Eleven, which has like a 1% margin, or Walmart, I think the Walmart's margins are similar too. If all of a sudden they're unionized now, they're not going to be able to stay in business for very long if your margin's that low. Like in the case of something like GM and whatnot, GM has a way higher margin than that on their cars than Walmart does on typical stuff. But you know,
I guess the other side of that would be, for the other side of that question for Ray would be, what would it be like through government regulation that you would prevent companies from essentially doing that, from like just firing people that want to union? Like, because if they just don't want to hire anyone that tries to unionize, what would be the way to prevent that?
So I mean, in the cases where we're okay with union presence, i.e., things that are not defense contractors or the military, in the case where we're okay with it, there would have to be like a regulation saying that it would be unlawful to discriminate against someone for being a member of a union in a sector where this is permitted, and in which obviously there is an institutional arrangement in which problems can be worked out. So hypothetically, let's say that you actually had a tripartite arrangement, and hypothetically, let's say that unions existed, and hypothetically, let's say that management had like been okay with it previously. Like if they suddenly decide that, okay, well now we're just going to fire everyone who is part of a union, then there should be a regulation that says it's unlawful for them to just do that. They would have to have the actual arbitration first. Like they shouldn't be able to just make the decision because they felt like it. Otherwise, they could just do it everywhere, couldn't they? They could just do it everywhere, anyone for anything.
If there's a neutral mediator that has to be in place, like I'll say this: if there is that sort of system set up, then yeah, I would say like you shouldn't be able to fire somebody for unionizing or anything. But if it's just this sort of case where you've got people going on strike versus the company and whatnot, I can definitely see why the company would be reluctant to want to have a union come in, especially if they're a company that's got a really low margin. So I guess I guess the issue for me is like I don't know, but I'm not sure if a system like that could ever really become a big thing in the United States, or at least not anytime soon. I just don't see there necessarily being the political what would you say support for that. Like a lot of people would probably consider that to almost be socialist or something, even though it's not. But I know that it would probably be branded as socialism, even if it's independent of the government or if it's impartial. But
I mean, obviously, I agree there needs to be a balance between the two things. So on the one hand, you can't literally bind companies' hands so that they can't fire anyone for any reason, because then, of course, obviously, you have like literally no job turnover and you just have seniority ruling, right?
Yeah.
Which then becomes a massive problem. But of course, on the other hand, I would say that if there is a case where there's institutional frameworks exist to resolve conflicts, then in the same measure, we should not have a situation where companies can avoid the arbitration by just making the person no longer an employee and then be like, well, the problem is solved.
Yeah.
Right? So
no, I know what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, maybe one way to do this, instead of having a regulation that just broadly says you can't fire people, because obviously that'd be too broad based, it should instead be that if a firing takes place, it should be justified in documentation with a justification, which can then be reviewed at some later date to find out whether you discriminated or not. Which I mean, maybe that actually exists already, because obviously I think equalities legislation probably makes that existent already. Like, for example, you can't like fire someone. Let me come up with something random here. Like, you can't fire someone for having a child, for example, or for being pregnant or something like this.
Right.
So like under the same principle, you should be able to say that in some cases, like if the person is trying to avoid labor capital arbitration, that they can't fire people as a transparent attempt to avoid having the arbitration.
Right. I guess a thing going along with that would be they would have to, and I would hope this already exists, where they have some kind of standard for determining what should count as like an actual union versus, I don't know, a bunch of workers getting together in some other kind of organization, because it just seems like, I'm not sure if companies could fire you for being a part of other, or like, because you could have, I would assume they'd be allowed to fire you if you're part of an organization.
Part of a WhatsApp group.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I assume that there's something that these people have to register as an actual union. I would think. I mean, I assume that already exists.
Well, yeah. You have to basically be like an official union for sure. I mean, they have a structure and everything to that.
You wouldn't want your competitors just to be able to like convince a bunch of your employees to form a union inside your company that is destroying it. You know what I mean? It's like there's all kinds of crazy things you could come up with. That's
especially if they're given like a golden parachute scenario, like, okay, let's say Citibank, for example, decides to support an uprising inside of Goldman Sachs on the basis that after the company has been destroyed, all the people who got fired for it can go and work at Citi.
Yeah.
So that goes along with kind of the corruption, I guess, within unions and things like that, which is...
Yeah, you've got to make sure these things are registered, so you can't just have like anyone declaring them like the People's Front of Unionization or something.
Yeah. I didn't really have anything else that I kind of wanted to address or anything. Was there anything else you want to go over, Ray?
No, I mean, I think we've actually gone through all of the talking points that I had, at least.
Yeah.
Like many of them, you actually brought them up without me having to actually say them, so that was really awesome.
Well, I guess the thing for me is like I'll say I'm not 100% certain about a lot of this sort of stuff. I think one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to have the debate was to kind of, you know, see if there's like some sort of common ground approach that we could have on something like this. And I think that like I said, I wouldn't have an issue with you know, having more unions in the economy if you had a truly impartial mediation process that was that wasn't biased against the corporate level and everything. Because I mean, you look at the case of like I go back to the auto workers union, where you've basically got union leaders that don't really care in the long run if the company's even necessarily profitable, as long as they can get, you know, their short-term benefits basically and whatnot from the company.
And we've seen this in other instances too. So, I mean, for example, of course, you know about the absolute set of disasters that was actually created in the United Kingdom during the early 1970s to mid 1970s, because there were certain opportunistic union leaders, such as what is his name again? Scar. Oh, I've forgotten his name now. He was a very famous union leader.
You mentioned him in the last time.
That's his name, Scargill. So,
Scargill, yeah.
Yeah, so Scargill, for example, was, and many others who were his contemporaries, were literally impossible to please. Like, you could do anything. Even when it came to the point where they came up with a what was called Command 3888, which was called, what was it, Beyond Strife or something like that. I think that's what that was called, where the government was coming up with this idea that they were going to have, and it was Baroness Castle who had organized this, which everyone was going to come and sit down and hammer out what an agreement was going to be, so that the strikes and the other nonsense would finally be able to stop, and that everyone would reach an agreement as to like how people should be remunerated and so on and so forth. And like, they refused to attend. They refused to attend, and so their refusal to attend, by the way, was like was like one of the actions that caused the absolute destruction of the union movement in the United Kingdom, actually. Because then from then on, everything went downhill. They ended up the winter of discontent. They ended up with that thing, which I think like had a large impact on the people who were like known as the baby boomer generation. A lot of them remember that when you talk about the late 1970s, because it got so bad that like the union officials within like the grave diggers like refused to operate. So they actually had like dead bodies that were just like refusing to be buried and stuff. It was so incredibly bad. And then Margaret Thatcher came and essentially smashed everything, right?
Well, that's why a lot of people look at Thatcher as a really, you know, positive figure and everything. At least a lot of people that I know have a really favorable view of Thatcher, because she took what was essentially an incredibly inefficient and stagnant system and you know, liberalized it in that sense. But you know, I guess as a
And this is the thing that I want to emphasize on that point as well, which is that everything that we've said here today, like, it doesn't remove obligations from unions and union leaders to behave in a way that is appropriate, because it is possible that even with the best system in place, or even with at least a serviceable system in place, individual union leaders or groups of people could actually still ruin it for themselves, which is of course one of the things about freedom being messy and all of that. But you know, they could still ruin it for themselves by choosing to make the wrong decisions at arbitrations, or simply deciding to not have arbitrations, or to refuse to attend them for whatever reason, right? So I mean, you know, people need to be careful of that, but it's one of those things where I wouldn't say that they should be prevented from having these things, but it's that there's always a chance that people may make the wrong decisions and cause and you know, cause unintended side effects. Like, I'm sure that people like Scargill and the others who are his contemporaries probably didn't intend to sound the death knell of the union movement at that time, but that's what they ended up doing, because they became completely intractable. Aside from that, there was also the nationalization issue that the United Kingdom had during that time period, which was that a lot of the industries were nationalized. They were uncompetitive because of like certain let's say institutional practices that they had adopted. They were getting beaten out left and right by companies from everywhere else that was not the United Kingdom, basically. I mean, it was so bad at one point that if you look up, for example, like United Kingdom worst cars ever produced and stuff like this, you'll get a lot of stories of like how did engineers actually come up with this, and you'll see that in some cases part of the reason why they came up with this is because they went too far with their attempt to democratize the workplace, to the point where on one of the cars that was listed as one of the worst cars in the UK, you'll probably see it come up at some point in one of the stories. I can't remember what his name was, but it was one of them where they actually had a collaborative approach to the design of the blueprints of the car. And they ended up with the front of the car not properly resembling the back of the car, and they ended up with the weight distribution on one of the cars being incorrect. Like it was like back heavy because of the fact that it was like a collaborative thing where one designer had designed the front of the car and a different one had designed the back. Truly incredible. And so
okay. We got to get this up on screen right now. Was that the Reliant Robin? Like, was it like a 3-wheeled car? Or
no, it was not. It was not a 3-wheeled car. Although that was bad too.
I was looking at that and I'm like, whoa, like who designed this? I'm just gonna see. So it was collaborative.
Yeah. It was a collaborative effort. I'm sure that it was on it was possibly a Vauxhall on which this occurred.
Huh. That's crazy. I'm gonna try to find this one right now. I mean, we've been looking at like cars and stuff on stream recently.
Yeah, I don't know.
Kind of a meme.
Yeah, a lot of the cars produced by British Leyland and by Vauxhall during that time period were like really bizarre because of the fact that they had overly democratized their production process, and they had overly democratized their design process, which is the one place where democracy does not belong, which is in design.
Yeah. Wow. Imagine that with an aircraft or something.
People in the chat are actually mentioning them. It could be the Austin Allegro or the Morris Marina.
Okay, I'll try that. Austin. Try that.
There was one other thing. I don't remember where I'd seen this. I think Kevin had mentioned it somewhere in the topics, and one of them was syndicalism, and I'm not sure if that was just a way of talking about unions or if you meant.
Well, I mean, we're there right now. We're on that topic right now.
Okay, I just left for a second.
Which is that we're on it, but by accident, right? Because one of the things that I was saying here basically is that unions is a nice thing. Increased workplace democracy is a nice thing, but there needs to be an understanding of human psychology and the limits of this, which is that if you try to democratize your design process, you're probably going to end up with the Morris Marina or the Austin Allegro.
Okay, so you're opposed to syndicalism then, I guess?
No, I'm okay with syndicalism. I'm just saying that there are limits to how much you can democratize your work.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, before it becomes a literal meme.
Right, I see.
So syndicalism, but like not in a naive
that seems to be what a lot of the like socialist left people, that it seems to be like my understanding of it is it's basically it is worker co-op. Is essentially workers control the company, basically. It seems to be a big it seems like there's a lot of people pushing for that nowadays on the YouTube left, Twitter left people.
Yeah, people like Vosh and stuff.
Yeah, they call themselves communists and things, but then they talk about workers co-ops like endlessly. And it seems to be like their big push is that maybe they view that as a stepping stone, or that's
although I don't know what their views are in terms of like internally how the company should actually run. But I'm hoping that they're not going to call for democratization of design process and stuff like this, because that will result in disaster.
I think it's I think it's literally like I think they're anarcho-syndicalists.
Yeah,
basically they just leave the first bit out. But I do think that it is literally they think it should be illegal to have a company that isn't operated that way.
That's right.
My understanding.
They think that the workers should basically own the means.
It should not be legal to have a company that's structured in a separate way.
Yeah, they see it as exploitation. And so for me, I call myself an anti-syndicalist because the thing with syndicalism is like syndicalism and unionization are a bit different. And actually, the funny thing is a lot of the syndicalists out there, they're not even really fans of Western labor unions because they see Western labor unions as like liberal bootlickers or whatever, basically, and which is kind of funny. I mean, it's kind of funny how wide the political spectrum is in that sense, because I know a lot of people that will see and basically that unions are you know, a gateway to communism and whatnot. And that, I guess that's a bit of an extreme way of looking at it, but that people on the other end, on the syndicalist side, they don't like unions because they see unions as a compromise with the executives and managers and stuff, and they don't think that those people should exist. So, like, they think that all companies should be basically public operations, like not like publicly traded. They don't believe in a stock market, any of that, a stonk market, any of that sort of stuff, right? So,
I mean that's quite an extreme interpretation of it that they've managed to adopt then. But yes, I mean, obviously, my contention with them, of course, would be the same one that I would have with I mean, the things that happened in the 1970s in the UK, for example, which was that did not end well.
Yeah, no, a lot of the syndicalists would probably say that Scargill guy didn't go far enough. Like, because a lot of the syndicalists on YouTube, at least, they want an actual violent revolution to overthrow capitalism. You know?
Which is, see, that's odd to me, because that shouldn't be a part of, I wouldn't think that would be a part of a syndicalist thing.
Exactly.
It's just that they happen to, I feel like a lot of them are more extreme, but they're arguing for syndicalism because they see that as a stepping stone. Like, as you have people like Vaush who will say he's a communist, but most of what he's arguing for is kind of a syndicalist type. He's arguing all about worker co-ops, which I've always found personally weird, because you can have a worker co-op right now. Like, my uncle was a part of one. There's not laws against it. I think their thing is they want that to be the only way you can structure a business.
No, that's right. They want it to be the only thing. And like, I don't have any problems with worker co-ops. So like, I just see that as like, it's the same thing as like forming a private company or whatever. You structure it how you want to structure it. Their problem is they see any profit model basically almost as exploitative is the problem, unless it's done in a co-op, I guess. But the problem is a lot of the reasons why co-ops are sometimes successful in the West is that the types of people that start co-ops and know what they're getting into with that, they know what they're signing up for and everything. They're a smaller set of people that almost, you know, they self-select.
It's a niche thing. Like, my uncle was it was a bar that like him and several other people operated as a co-op. Like, so it wasn't, you know, a huge business or
it's the sort of thing though that like the people that know what they're getting into there and everything, they're probably going to be better at it than the average person. Whereas it would be kind of like if you had everybody all of a sudden was going to, I don't know, Yale or something. The average grades at Yale would probably go down if everybody was all of a sudden at Yale, for example, because it's like a self-selected group of people that are in there. Or even if you're like one of the dumber people in the class, you're probably still going to have an above average performance or something academically compared to the average population. Likewise, if you had every company in the entire economy or every operation in the entire economy be a worker co-op, a lot of people there probably wouldn't be profitable. And then what do you do about that? Like, because people say, well, co-ops are profitable. There are these profitable co-ops in the West. And it's like, yeah, but they're a small number of firms, and those that started the firms knew what they were getting into. And they're the types of people that would probably be successful at that. Whereas a lot of people, they just see a job as a paycheck, and they don't want to put in the effort that would require to make a co-op profitable, because it takes a lot more effort if you're one of a co-op partners than if, say, you're just like, you know, a random employee at an established firm, right? But where you're just like taking orders and stuff. But
yeah, so I mean, I would agree that like the entirety of human psychology needs to be brought into the situation, and they shouldn't just barrel into that without realizing what they're getting into, or attempt to apply it to every human being as though it's going to play out the same way.
Yeah. It's always seemed to me like there's kind of a moral question there too about is it right to prevent like an individual from, I'm going to start a business, and if I can get other people to consent and agree to work for me in my business model, that I own the business and I, you know, structure it how I want, then is it right to kind of go in and tell a person they can't do that if they're not coercing anyone. Which I guess the argument from the other side is that the whole system is inherently coercive. Would be what they would say. Is
they would say it's false.
People don't have a choice. It's kind of interesting. I've been listening to Vouch's and Destiny's debate about this from yesterday.
Oh, that's great. They debated recently, didn't they?
Yeah, like just yesterday. That's what I was telling you pre-stream about that. Our buddy Alien Millsrow kind of spurred that on.
That's right.
He was essentially, the argument there was, you've got these people arguing for this system that it should be structured this way, but there's many of them with their YouTube channels that don't actually do that. They don't operate there because they have people that work for them, editors, this sort of thing, and they're not a co-op, but they advocate for this syndicalist model, but they don't run their own business that way. And so it's kind of a question of, is that hypocritical? Is that, and Vouch was kind of saying, well, it's the system we're in.
This is the thing I used to taunt people with as well. While I was saying to certain leftist content creators who I will not name, I said to them, well, here's an interesting thing. My Discord server ironically operates in quite a syndicalist fashion because of the fact that I don't just hand down things from on top. Everything has to be subject to a vote via the moderators first, right? I am the only quote unquote progressive content creator who does this. Everyone else operates their own
they're authoritarians.
Pretty much like a mini fiefdom in which they are a dictator. So I'm like, guys, if you can't even get this thing done on like the micro level, what is it going to look like when you actually go outside of the Discord server and attempt to do this anywhere else?
Well, what's funny is there's this joke, this ongoing meme in the Hot Gang group that I run, because after we had some people leaking DMs and everything, I basically said, like, look, nobody adds anybody without my permission, all this kind of stuff and everything. I'm like, I run this pro-democracy group with an iron fist, and it's the same kind of a meme, because obviously we're the Hot Gang. But at the same time, everything's got to go through the great leader, basically, is the idea of it. So it is funny.
You're not calling. No, I mean, to be fair, in your case, you're not calling for absolute democracy. Sorry, you're not calling for a direct democracy, though. So
no, I'm actually a big fan
of
representative democracy, though. I think that the direct democracy is a path to anarchy. Actually, like that's not a thing that can sustain itself and ward off more cohesive regimes from taking over. It's the same reason with anarchism. I'll often hear this argument from anarchists about how, well, Catalonia and stuff would have succeeded if the rest of the world was anarchist. But it's like, okay, but the rest of the world is always going to have states in it. How is your system going to be able to survive to reach global hegemony if it can't even... Like, if you're getting overrun by fascists that were already actually weak and worn down, then how does that even work? How are you going to resist? How are you going to resist the fascist regime that hasn't had a bunch of war going on?
Yeah, it's almost like they're arguing it would have totally worked if not for political reality.
Yeah, I mean, I see that argument. Actually, I see that argument a lot of times about how people would say, well, it wasn't real because of this, or it would work if the rest of the world went with my view or whatnot. Or we had that argument basically from MMI on the debate with MMI, where he said, like, look, I'm for neoliberal imperialism and everything, and outsourcing is good and all this kind of stuff, but I'm against it with China. And I'm like, but that's almost like it wasn't true neoliberalism. Like, it's like the Soviet Union wasn't true communism or whatever. It's like almost all the outsourcing went to China. So it's like, so this idea, oh no, it's good, it's just in practice it's been bad. It's like, well, at some point, how does that work?
Exactly.
But I just, I think the thing with Vosh and those guys specifically, because I've seen how they've addressed it, because when actual Justice Warrior called him out on that, Vosh said something like, well, I'm basically like a business owner or whatever. I do my thing, and he basically argued that he was different. And actually, Cenk Uygur made the same point. Like, we talked about Cenk earlier on, but the reason why Cenk said that the Young Turks, like, he fired people for trying to start a union, for example, the Young Turks. The reason why he said that they can't have a union there is because they're a small company and it would basically bankrupt them. The problem is he also could be the largest online news network. So it's like, are you a small business or are you huge? Like, which is it?
Exactly. It's a very weird excuse he gave there.
Because the thing is, I actually understand his point. I mean, I get their emails, and they're always like, "Oh, we're $200,000 short this month," and all this kind of stuff, which is
they're
funny.
always asking for donations in that case.
Always asking for donations, and the thing that's funny is they had a $20 million infusion of capital a few years back, and they proceeded to fire half of their crew because they only wanted to do their main political show after that. And it's like, how are you guys hemorrhaging money? And
I'm mystified by that too. Like, I don't even know. I can't even imagine how they could be losing money at this point if they're the largest show on online. Like, could they not have monetized that in some way?
Well, the problem for them is that they have over 5 million subscribers. Yet, if you go to a typical video of them, they'll have less than 40,000 views, and you're like, that'd be like if my channel had 3 views on each video or something. You're like, wait, what's happening? Like. Because if you go to Jimmy Dore is a tenth the size of them, and he gets more views per video than them. So I know they put out a lot of content.
So they have a large number of subscribers who, for whatever reason, don't click on their videos anymore.
Yeah, about 97% of their subscribers don't even watch their stuff. Like, I'm just looking at their stuff right now. From the last 2 days, the most popular video that they had out of 12 videos had it had 102,000 views. So that's 2% that actually watch their stuff. Yeah. So
there must be something they're doing wrong on social media, because I bet you if they weaponized Twitter more effectively, they would probably be able to drive more people to click on the thing. But what's actually happening is they don't seem to use their Twitter in that way. Whereas I think that people like Jimmy Dore and so on are using it that way.
Yeah, that's probably a good point. It's just, how would they have not have realized that? Well, Zaya says that TYT is full of dead subs. So... or like legacy
people who subbed years ago and then have like since stopped being active on YouTube. I mean, that's also possible too, given how long they've been around for.
Yeah, that's true.
This whole thing, it kind of reminds me with the hypocrisy. I don't necessarily think that them being hypocritical means that they're incorrect, because like it sort of reminds me when I see that going on is like, if you look back in history in the United States, you had people that would put out like just be completely against slavery, tearing it apart, saying it was an unethical system and bad, yet they owned slaves themselves. Like several of the founding fathers did this, where they were saying like slavery is awful, it's a terrible institution, it makes no sense, yet they participate in it, and their excuses are
so,
more or less the same. It's that this is what we live in, but it's not good, and it's obviously, like, I don't think that Cenk Uyghurs
what we're
is
doing here is a little bit of a meme, because we were doing the "yet you participate very curious" meme. I know.
That's the meme. That's the meme. It's like, oh, you're critical of society, yet you participate in society. That's that stupid meme.
And I can get it to a lesser level too, because it's like for me or anyone who's like, oh yeah, the conditions in sweatshops or child slave labor is bad, but we still buy the products. And it's like, well, that's a different thing than directly like owning a sweatshop or something.
Yeah, I mean, okay, yeah. So I get what you're saying. Yeah, it's possible for them to be correct, but personally still hypocritical. So I mean, yes, maybe it could be argued that yes, TYT should have been unionized, but that Cenk Uyghur is a hypocrite, right?
Well, I think he was right about I think he was right about the profitability of it, though, because they are, I mean, if they're true in their emails, they're losing money every month, so they can't afford to unionize. But then he'll go after Walmart and Amazon and everything for not having unions and everything. And his argument is that they're just bigger. But then he claims to be the biggest in his sector. So, like, they're the biggest in their sector. I don't know. And then you'll have people like Vosh and stuff, where it's generally this idea that they're exempt because I guess they're smaller is kind of the idea or whatever. The thing that's funny about Vosh is like, Vosh has said on stream before that he makes 6 figures doing what he does, which is crazy. But,
well, the arguments he was making in the debate with Destiny last night or yesterday was essentially it's not causing any harm, because if they don't work for these people who are exploiting them, they'll just work for someone else who's exploiting them. So it makes no difference either way. And Destiny's whole thing was, well, it's wrong because you're not living your own values, essentially. That seemed to be the crux of the argument there. Was he was essentially attacking them for being hypocrites, and Vash was saying, well, possibly, but it makes no... He was coming from a very utilitarian moral view of, well, it doesn't actually harm any more people because they're either, participating in the system under these people, or they're going to do it under some other people. But the odd thing there is that, to me, with that argument, is that there's no reason you can't operate a worker co-op. Like, I guess you could say it's untenable economically for a small person to do it, or something like that.
Yeah. But like, again, he's the one advocating for it, though. Like, obviously, like, Ben Shapiro's not, so nobody's gonna say like, oh, Ben Shapiro's a hypocrite or whatever. Vosh is. I guess the question that I would have then is like, what is the threshold? Because I don't know how much Vosh makes, but he makes more than $100,000 a year. That's a crazy amount of money to do YouTube. So he obviously has to spend some money on keeping up.
I don't think it was specifically about him versus these other bigger channels, because I don't know how many people, if Vosh even has employees. I assume he has one or two, maybe.
I know he has artwork creators and stuff like that and everything. Like at this channel, Arthur does the graphics and he does some of the artwork and everything. And I pay him some money from the patron gang each month to go compensate him for that. Basically, his computer.
You don't give Arthur a vote on how your channels run.
No. Well, he gave me advice on lighting, but I've been too busy and lazy to actually get around to doing it. But he suggested having the lights positioned on the ground and faced upwards as opposed to what they are right now. What do you guys think of it the way they look right now? Like, do they look too?
Looks fine.
Yeah,
looks all right to me.
Because in Vosh's case, Vosh does have them on the ground, I guess, going upwards, and it's a lot more dim. I guess, kind of like it's more subtle. I guess.
These are things you don't pay attention to if you don't use a camera.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. The only thing you have to worry about is your avatar, basically, and it looks pretty swaggy. So, yeah.
The thing they're saying in chat is that apparently Arthur is going to vote you out if it became a co-op.
Yeah, if it became a co-op,
Arthur's going to he's going to fire Kevin.
Just take over the channel.
Yeah, like say we became a co-op, then the problem, like I guess the problem with that though is that Arthur's definitely a lot better than me at graphics, basically. I suck at graphics. What are we gonna do? I do half the graphics now, and half of them are like shitty. Like, how would that work? Like, look, you get that car situation. It would
be the British Leyland way to do things, right? Half the graphics are bad.
Yeah, I know, right? I mean, like in that sense, I guess part of the problem with like syndicalism at large is that if everything's democratized, then you almost in a way lose the specialization division of labor.
Exactly.
And that's what made civilization. And I know that some syndicalists might probably chime in and say, well, no, there would still be a hierarchy, but it would be democratically elected and everything. But I guess my problem is like, how could that system actually be democratic? Because you would have done away with the actual democratic system that we have right now. Like, because they don't want to necessarily operate within the United States as we know of the United States. Like most syndicalists want to go to a post-Western system that's like the Soviet Union or something.
That was a huge part of the conversation I had with that anarchist Zoomer Nation was about specialization. Because essentially, it was more about like arguing for representative democracy, and I was saying, well, not everyone can know is going to be as fully participated as a full-time politician in crafting laws and knowing specific things about specific legal, like the economy or the foreign policy. Like, there's all sorts of specialized areas of that. And his thing was, he was kind of arguing that, well, everyone should be a Renaissance person that knows everything about everything. And my thing was that it was just not really possible in this day and age to do that.
We have access to the internet. It would be the easiest of any time in history to actually do that potentially.
There's just so much there's so much more you would have to know. I mean,
but it wouldn't work. It still wouldn't.
You couldn't
work
be a car mechanic and also know about like specific like divorce law or something. It's just too much. There's I mean.
Yeah, no, until we can slow down time so that you can like do 1,800 hours of research per day.
Society's just so complicated nowadays.
Yeah.
And whenever people like are outside of their wheelhouse, they will resort to the thing that they intuitively know to be true. So someone, Henry actually was the one who mentioned divorce law just now, for example, right? So if we're just doing this rotational thing, because I've heard some utopianists talk about this one as well, where everyone rotates and gets to do a different job each day or something.
Oh, yeah, the preschool economy.
So imagine this scenario in which like I get to be the divorce lawyer for a day. So of course I know nothing about divorce law beyond the basic fundamentals that you need to know. So I would just so like my day as divorce lawyer would just be like, okay, the woman is always right. Moving on, right? Would I be a very good divorce lawyer? I do not know. So yeah, no, you should not have people rotating themselves through jobs that they don't actually do.
So the MRAs have told me that's the way it is now. So.
So I mean, for some people, it might not make a difference.
That's true, and
you're spot on. I like wildlife.
Yeah, and the Afghanistan war was specifically done to impose that system on Afghanistan. So.
Yeah,
that's a reference to last night's debate.
Yeah, I kind of
wait. That was actually a quote said by a person.
Oh, yeah,
not exactly.
I kind of blew up on him because I was moderating, but at the end of the debate, he asked for my honest opinion multiple times. I was like, I'm supposed to be neutral. And he kept asking me, and then I just went off on the dude about how stupid everything he said was.
Yeah, he
was saying that we were in Afghanistan to spread
transgendered
ideology to the Afghan villagers.
Wait. Tell me that you guys stopped him at that point. We're like, wait.
Well, no. I argued with him for 4 hours.
I was supposed to be neutral. I didn't say anything until he asked me to stop being neutral and give my honest opinion.
If you have the time and you want to see that debate, you could watch the whole thing and give me the watch minutes, which I always appreciate. But if you want to just do yourself a favor, just watch the part from when he's like, oh, no, I want to see what you think, Henry. I know you're the moderator, but what do you think about what I've said tonight? Then it gets wild. That's the part you actually want to watch. So
yeah, at some point before the end of this coming weekend, I will have watched that then, because that sounds like that was absolutely a wild time.
It was regarded as the most wild debate that I've ever actually done, and I still think the one with MMI was probably crazier, and some people thought the one with Hedefax was maybe a bit crazier, but a lot of people were like, this was crazy. Like it got to the point where people were like sending me donations just to get him to say like, okay, $10 to Kevin if he says Putin is the savior of the West. And I'm like, okay, so do you think Putin's the savior of the West? And he's like, well, like if AOC becomes president, then like, yeah, he would be the savior of the West. And
it was so all over the place too. He was literally telling us about how he gets mentally handicapped. The FBI gets mentally handicapped people to go in the woods around campfire drunk to be terrorists.
Yeah, the FBI basically.
It was so weird.
If I remember, he was arguing that the Alphabet Boys they'll have agents that are also informants that are paid, go in there and start groups that are supposed to be terrorist groups, and then go up to, I can't remember who used the word. Somebody used the word tard, like get random tards drunk in the woods, and then arrest them for saying like, oh, do you want to kill Pelosi? And they'll be like, yeah, I want to kill Pelosi. And they'll be like, okay, you're facing 48. Like, it was so funny. It was so funny. That debate was insane. I couldn't believe, because he kept going back to the argument that, well, Kevin, you want to spend $50 billion a year for transgenders in Afghanistan, basically, and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, it was wild. It was a crazy debate. And, he didn't.
It's a very weird angle for him to criticize that war from as well. Like, what did he actually want then?
He wanted the U.S. to like basically, well, I called him out and I said, are you calling for the US to pull out troops? And he's like, well, no, I'm not pull out troops, but like, it's been too long. It's been 20 years and all this. But the funny thing is he closed his debate performance by saying that China's going to win because they have strong leaders that want to get wins. Whereas for us, we're going to lose. So therefore, Bush and Cheney and Liz Cheney are horrible. And he said that they were the worst kinds of Republicans. And Reese came on after for the post show, and he's like, wait, so this guy wants the West to win. So therefore, he wants like Trump type people, wants to kick out Bushes and Cheneys. Okay. So
yeah, that was completely self-contradictory then. So I'm bracing for that self-contradiction when I hear it then, which is basically he thinks that the United States should concede and retreat, but at the same time he also castigates the United States for conceding and retreating.
Kind of. He did say though that he'd be fine with maintaining a base in Afghanistan if the US was just there to take the resources. That's what he said. So but Henry brought up how like, dude, you're saying that the U.S. Army's there to spread what we would think of as Western feminist, doctrine to people there. And Henry, you basically said you were never sent out on any missions to teach kids.
Oh yeah, I was literally there, and that was why it was like I was holding my tongue that entire time, just like, what the fuck is this guy talking about? Spreading feminism in Afghanistan, like that never came up. Like it's about the enemy's controlling, and the point I made there was the people we were helping were not feminists, not even like they were more or less feminist than like right-wing Americans, the people we were aiding and like trying to put in control. I mean, they still largely viewed women as property and wanted them to be covered. They didn't, they weren't as brutal as the Taliban, I guess.
But Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell said that the war in Afghanistan, you can't leave because Afghan feminism. That's
like the way I could put it to contrast them is like there was the guy from the north who was one of our interpreters I worked with. Is they were a little more civilized. I don't know if that's a mean thing to say, but they were in the north where he essentially put it like, yeah, it's still viewed very poorly and socially shamed if you sleep outside of marriage. But like in the South, around where we're fighting, a lot of the Pashtuns and the Taliban, a lot of the Taliban is Pashtun. A lot of them, like they will straight up hang people for sleeping outside of marriage. So it'd be stuff like that. And then like, the women down there, I hardly saw any women. I think I saw 2 women, Afghan women, the entire time I was there. We literally had to have a FET team. We would have women specifically because when I was in, there was no women in the infantry. We had specifically 2 women. Their job, essentially, mostly they helped out with various things, but the reason we would have them is they could go in and talk to Afghan women because we were not allowed to talk to their women. Like that was not, like they wouldn't let. I don't think they would let strangers, but especially foreign American infidel strangers talk to their women was a big no. And so they would be able to go in there and assess them because sometimes they would be beaten, raped, and just like take and when I say raped, I don't mean like it would be like their husbands doing something. I won't get too graphic about it. It's basically to assess various things that are going on because sometimes the women would have information, but it's the idea that we were there trying to convert them to be like American feminists or the transgender thing. I don't know where he got that. That was not even like,
absolutely out of like left field.
No, it was a wild debate.
I think that he's doing something that I've seen a lot of people who are in like the what do you call it? This isn't far right doing, where they're extrapolating social processes that will take place over the next 100 to 150 years and are sort of backporting that into being like America's specific intention. So, for example, if you were to liberate Afghanistan completely from the Taliban and you were to allow the flourishing of women's employment and so on, then you would be effectively replicating the seeds that could eventually lead to the indigenous expression of an Afghan feminism, which would not be actually created by white people, would be created indigenously by them because of the fact that women who have more economic power will eventually begin to advocate for their own rights, which is the same thing that happened in the West about 100 years ago.
Right.
So maybe that's what he is perceiving. But then, like, why would he say that would be a bad thing if Afghan people arrived at that position on their own? Surely that's more freedom. So why is that bad?
No. But he kept on going back to about women's rights and everything. I got the impression
based on a quote from Mitch McConnell, which was like an offhand thing about women's rights, which is like when you're talking about women's rights in Afghanistan, it's not. It's like, stopping them from stoning women. Like it's
threw that in.
This guess was basically to the right of Mitch McConnell. Then, if he's finding
he thinks Mitch McConnell.
He said he voted for Kerry, though. That was the weird thing.
He said Romney was a leftist. So this guy obviously, he said that he was more a bit left wing on economics, but super socially conservative. He said, well, that's their culture. And he's like, oh, well, if you want to care about, like, because I said, I'm like, wait, so you don't think that women should have rights or whatnot? And he's like, yeah, but we're talking about Afghanistan and everything. So, like, he's one of those sovereignty people where he just doesn't care about anything outside of America.
Even in that context, though, the sovereignty argument couldn't work because, like, the people of Afghanistan don't want to be ruled by the Taliban. So,
but he would say, well, it's not our job. He literally did the "When are you joining the military?" though meme. And by the way, I think it was Kanzik sent me $15 if he did the meme, and he did the meme. That was pretty funny. So big ups to Kanzik. And like I said, I'm like, wait, you're gonna do the meme, aren't you? You're gonna ask when am I joining the military though? And he's like, yeah, but Kevin, when are you joining the military though? As if that's an argument. He's like, if you want to die for transgenderism in Afghanistan,
did you guys present to him the idea that if you were to leave the Taliban to their own devices, they want to commit genocide against 5 different ethnic groups?
Well, I didn't even bring up that argument.
It allows them to do that.
No, I brought up.
It wasn't even on that level, though. He was asking Kevin, like, Kevin, what would you say to a soldier who had his legs blown off in Afghanistan fighting for feminism? That was a literal question he asked Kevin.
Yeah, so the thing is, he's like, you can't even answer. He said to me, he's like, you can't even answer.
It like implies something that's so stupid.
I immediately proceeded to deconstruct his stupid premise because I'm like, wait, okay, so the Afghanistan war was over 9/11. And he's like, you can't answer the question. You can't answer the question.
This would be almost like if he came to you and said, there's a car made entirely out of Jell-O. What do you think of this? And then you're like, I have no idea. What the hell is that? And he's like, you can't even answer my question.
Yeah, it was goofy. I do have a submission from Arthur, actually. He has the new branding of the channel, if we're running a co-op. No, this is too good. This is too good. Arthur just made this right now. This is what our branding would look like if it was a collaborative co-op at the.
It's 50% in MS Paint. Yes, brilliant.
No, but it's so true. Like I can't do graphic design for crap. No, it's so good. It's so good. That's exactly what it looked like, because that's Arthur. Well, actually, I won't spoil it. Who's who here?
Arthur's the one on the left. You're the one on the right.
Yeah, I'm pretty much going to go with that one too.
Yeah, that's right. Probably a good guess. That's probably a good guess. But we did have another fan submission. This was from Kanzik the other day. This is me and Reese. So he made this. So
imagine a suit here.
Yeah, imagine a suit here, because he can draw better than I can. He can at least do paint. I can't even do paint, but I can draw words and letters. So and try to draw a semicircle. Yeah, so that's what it would look like. That's what it would look like if we had a collaborative co-op here. Like, could you imagine if Vosh's channel was just a co-op of Vosh and like everybody that has done art and stuff for Vosh, what it would probably look like?
What a disaster. It would be an absolute garbage disaster.
Well, the thing is, I guess it might actually be better because Vosh's takes tend to be so
actually, I don't think the co-op model necessarily means everyone shares the labor. That's to be fair. Okay. I think that their argument is everyone gets a say in running the company. So it's not that you all.
So, yeah, it's probably possible to operate the system correctly. It's just that obviously the joke about British Leyland is that they democratized everything, including the design process, and ended up with design by committee, which, as we all know, design by committee ends up with like everyone commits that. That is designed by committee.
That's designed by the committee of committee.
Yeah, I think that they're to steelman them. Their argument would be, well, the committee would say we're going to put the best people. So, like, as a committee, you would vote for Arthur to do the graphic design.
Of course.
Because he's good at
that's
it.
what should happen.
Yeah, but I guess the problem that I have with syndicalism and whatnot, and this idea of like the total democratization of the economy, is like these people are the same ones who want to get rid of the liberal democratic system that exists right now and have a basically like a Soviet sort of idea controlling everything. The problem is, once you step outside of liberal democracy, then who's to stop the most brutal comrade from just rounding everybody else up and consolidating power? Like, how would that system even exist? So
that's the thing that I don't understand. Yes, actually, that's a good question as well, because many of the people who are calling themselves syndicalists on YouTube also
they're not democratic.
Also at the same time hold positions that would seem to animate against that. Which is
they're against labor unions because they see them as upholding the status quo in the West, which is this democratic capitalist sort of system. And so these people want to move outside of a democracy. The irony is, like, they want democracy in the workplace and in the economy, but they want to do away with the political democratic system. Or some of them, like Vosh says, he cares about democracy and everything, but the problem is, in order to transition to that, and he's even said before, you'd have to do a violent revolution.
Yeah. They don't seem to understand that the process of having that transition that they're talking about, then if it's going to be some sort of uprising they're talking about, it inherently manufactures non-democratic ways of doing things. For the same way that we just talked about earlier on, where it's like we both agreed that like it's impossible to have a union inside of a military structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can't have unions inside the military. So if you're having if they are having some kind of uprising in some kind of country somewhere in which the existing leadership is replaced by a new set of vanguard leaders who are a quasi-military organization, is there going to be a union inside of that organization, or have a tendency to not produce that?
I mean, it would basically become like the Soviet Union or Cambodia or something, but
the weird thing for them about being really pro-democratic, I've always viewed capitalism and like the market system as being a kind of a democratic system that's just, you know, like you could have it where everyone votes on what's produced or whatnot. I just view the capitalist method as the free market, well, maybe not regulated market method, as being more a streamlined version of democracy, because basically people are voting with their money what they want produced. Because how do you know how much bread someone wants somewhere versus somewhere else? Well, they buy it. That informs people what to produce. My problem has always been the reason I would advocate for UBI is, well, if people don't have enough money to say we demand this much of this resource here or there, then that's an issue. But I feel like that's resolved through a negative income tax or UBI or something along those lines. I kind of view it as a democratic process, basically. You're kind of voting with your money about what gets produced.
Well, I should also clarify that ordinarily when people use the term syndicalism, that's not supposed to imply an abolition of markets. Right? These structures are still supposed to be able to trade with each other in a normal market system in which prices can be discovered, right? If you abolish the market entirely, then I think that most people, I mean, including people at the Mises Institute even, would argue that if you abolish the market system, then it's impossible to have syndicalism because there would be no way of discovering prices. Instead, what you would have is you would have a planned economy in the form of the Soviet Union, and we all know how that ends.
Yeah, that's
right.
True. That's true. But I'm
that's always been my thing with the co-op thing, where they'll say, you know, well, someone will have to work for them or whatever. And I don't know. For me, with UBIs, you don't have to work for the co-op either. You can just tell everyone to fuck off, and like you'll live off your UBI or start a business or something like that. But it's it shouldn't. Syndicalism wouldn't imply that. I was talking more about other people who they seem to be advocating for syndicalism as a stepping stone to abolishing the free market and currency, even entirely, in certain ways.
I've not been able to get a grasp or an understanding of how they see this stepping stone process either. Because, like, if hypothetically these people were able to establish syndicalism, which depends on the existence of markets and the existence of currency in order for prices to be discovered, then how would they manage to get from there to convincing people then to accept a planned economy in which there is no currency? No one has been able to explain that to me, because in human psychology, if you've got a thing, if they got that working and people were satisfied with it, how would you then get them to the opposite of that position?
Yeah, I don't understand it either. I just view it as
these things are associated right now is because both of them have the appellate left attached to them. So people are like putting them close to each other, or there are people who saying that they prefer both of them at the same time somehow. But these two things are very opposed to each other.
Yeah, I don't understand it either. I think it's kind of a reflexive thing on the left to go against any sort of anything about capitalism, other than the best you can get them to say a lot of times is, well, capitalism's better than feudalism. It's like kind of the
of course.
They won't acknowledge any kind of like deficiencies in the method.
And then, of course, you've got like the ever spiraling purity spiral that goes on as well, which is where you have this conversation now, where you have some people on the extreme left who are like critical of people who espouse socialism, because apparently socialism still involves a market, and they are so against markets that they don't even want a market if the market has a red flag on it. So, it's, I don't know. Let's put it this way: social media is doing some very weird things right now.
Yeah, I mean, they've gone after AOC and everything.
Yes, I couldn't believe that. Like, I was thinking,
like this guy.
Not enough already?
Like this guy, Jimmy Dore there. He's gone after Jank and Anna and AOC, called Anna Kasparian a pro.
That was so insane to me that they went after her for like she's a freshman congresswoman. She's very popular in the media, but she doesn't really have a lot of power, guys. Like, they're acting like, oh, AOC should get us, socialized healthcare or something. It's like she can't. Yep. I mean,
and the thing is, she wasn't even disagreeing with them on the substance. She was simply saying that there are certain strategies you have to undertake when you're dealing with the political system as it exists in the US, and she believes in one particular strategy, and Jimmy Dore happens to believe in a completely different strategy, right? So but instead of having that conversation, this is something that Sam Cedar also said that I think he actually got right, which was that unfortunately, instead of Jimmy Dore choosing to have the argument of, okay, is my strategy better than your strategy? Instead, Jimmy Dore made it about an identification process, which is, if you disagree with Jimmy Dore, you become a traitor.
Yeah.
And that was the main problem with what Jimmy Dore was doing. He made it all about himself, and basically was doing that cringe thing he likes to do, where anyone who doesn't agree with Jimmy Dore is somehow morally suspect.
The fraud squad. But I will say though, I think I'm kind of busy and everything and whatnot, and I think we've gone on for quite a while. I don't really have anything else to add on the actual topic or anything here, but we could do closing statements if that works. I don't really have too much to say on that, but
yeah, me neither. I mean, I have hardly anything for closing. I mean, I don't even have a closing statement planned.
Well, we don't even really need to do closing statements. Then I'll just say I'm not really going to do a post show or anything tonight. I got a lot of stuff to work on, but this was a bit of a different tone to our debate tonight than last night's debate. Last night's debate was a bit more of the blood sports variety, so that was wild. I think everybody should probably go. Like, if you're disappointed that there wasn't enough fighting or whatever on this one, there's plenty of fighting. You can go and watch last night's debate. Last night's debate was insane. That was spectacular. We've never had the moderator been asked to give his actual opinion on. No, it's just, I'm not sure I've seen that I've watched a lot of debates online and stuff. I've watched Sargon debates.
Yeah.
I've watched.
I mean, usually people just don't do that because they know that the moderator cannot do that, right? The whole point of the moderator is the moderator doesn't give their opinion.
I've never seen that happen before. I've seen like Vosh do debates and stuff that are moderated. I've never seen one party say to the moderator, "So what do you think of me?" Like, your actual honest opinion. What do you think?
I don't know what. Well, he said it's because he thought the debate was over or whatever. But I don't know if he was expecting me, because I was very nice to him, and I kind of even pushed back on some of Kevin's stuff. But I think he just didn't understand where I was gonna. Because I went from 0 to 100, just because I was like, oh, thank God he asked me this. And
what did you think that was going to happen when he came into that debate in the first place?
Well, he when he came in to debate me, he started off with about 5 minutes that he intended to question me, to understand my political views and where I was coming from, which I thought was funny because I would have thought that people would do that research beforehand, but
Indeed.
he knew me. The reason why he challenged me to a debate was because he saw this thumbnail for a video that I uploaded recently on celebrating Liz Cheney winning the vote to remove her from her leadership position in the House caucus for the Republican Party. And he came on and said, wow, I can't believe it. I found somebody who's an actual unironic supporter of Cheney and Bush. I want to debate you. But the thing is, he didn't know anything about me apart from that. And so
he essentially came in and got killed as a consequence.
But it wasn't. He still could have done fine even without knowing much about me per se, because he could have taken the debate in a different direction or something.
I think that was what had set me off about him, was that he came into it like with a very kind of condescending and antagonistic tone, while at the same time saying like insane, stupid things, which it was just like, I hate it when people do that. Like, I don't even mind necessarily if you have that tone with someone, but like if you're doing it and then saying things that are so off the wall that it's just like, man,
Exactly. It was kind of like an unearned sense of smugness that he had, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, he kept coming back to this idea, oh yeah, because we need to have women's rights in Afghanistan and everything. And I would often respond with, wait, so are you against women's rights and all this kind of stuff? Because I was arguing that women's rights in Afghanistan being strengthened was a byproduct of the retaliation against the Taliban. And he was saying, oh, but it's not about the Taliban anymore because it's been too long. And then I'm like, oh, so.
Oh, wow.
So it's 1943. The war's gone on for 4 years. It's been too long. Let's just call it over. It's
not about Hitler anymore. It's been too long.
It's been too long. It's been too long. What does that even mean? It's been too long. And he would say things like, yeah, but $50 billion or $2 trillion, that's a lot of money. Like, how can you say that it's immaterial and all this? And I'd be like, yeah, but that's over 20 years. And the U.S. produced $400 trillion of output over that time and whatnot. I mean, it's like, it would be like saying, you know, and I've said this before, that like in an ideal world, everybody would save up money and buy a house in cash and everything. But if you were going to go the mortgage route, it would be kind of dumb to base whether or not you could afford a house based on the price of the house if you were going to do it as a mortgage. Like, oh yeah, the house costs $400,000 and it's a 25-year mortgage. I don't have $400,000 this year, therefore I can't afford the mortgage. It's like, no, you can probably afford the mortgage with less than $400,000 in the first month. You're just going to pay interest through the roof over 25 years, which is often more than the price of the house, but you could still technically afford it. Whereas he's like, but $2 trillion. I'm like, over 20 years. He's like, yeah, but it's a lot of money. Very big number, bad, basically, was what it was.
Exactly.
Very large number, scary. So
this is going to be amazing to watch, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was crazy. The fact that I thought that the debate was just going to be, okay, it's going to be like that very polite one I had with Ohio leftists, where Ohio wanted to debate like a Bush supporter and everything. So he came on here and he was pretty nice. And we had some disagreements over, you know, whether or not it's a justified cost with the war and all that kind of stuff, and whether or not you consider Iraq a success. But he was a cool guy, and I would happily debate him again. And he seemed pretty nice and stuff. And I figured, well, this is probably going to be the same. This is a guy who just wants to tell me that the war in Afghanistan was like, it was inefficient, cost too much or whatever. No. It's immediately, oh, really? You want to send young kids to die for transgender rights in Kabul? Basically. Like, as if that's what the war was about.
Wow.
As if, oh, can't retaliate for anything because that would cost money. So, and I asked him if he believed that 9/11 was an inside job. He said no. He said that Al-Qaeda did it. I'm like, who helped Al-Qaeda?
So, there's so many weird things about it. He said he voted for John Kerry. Like, there's so many weird.
He voted for John Kerry.
He said he was okay with, you know, gay marriage and transgendered people, but I don't know.
Just in America. But
that's a very weird talking point. And also, voting for John Kerry, of all people, given that John Kerry was in favor of all of the things that this guy says he's against.
Yeah, he voted.
John Kerry was not against the war in Afghanistan, so
he voted for John Kerry. Then he voted for Donald Trump afterwards, and he said that he hates Bush because Bush was weak on China and immigration. But
I would ask him. You know what I would have asked him. I bet you guys probably didn't ask him in stream. I would have asked him, who are the top 30 followers in his Twitter right now? And I bet you he would read off a list of like bizarre propaganda accounts because
no,
that's got to be the reason how he could have gone from voting for John Kerry to voting for Trump.
Ray, we couldn't say anything about his Twitter account. That was one of the conditions, was that couldn't mention anything about it. No. This became a huge meme. No, this became a huge meme in the debate, and everybody was laughing in the chat because it was a stipulation that I couldn't mention his social media and I couldn't mention any like his YouTube stuff or anything. And I agreed. I'm like, okay, we'll do the debate, and then you'll go on your way, and that'll be that. So as the debate drew on, we were like, okay, you keep saying that Mitch McConnell said we can't leave Afghanistan because of women's rights. And that was like, there's no way that that's true. But the thing is, I'm like, okay, so where, and Henry said too, he's like, okay, it's just like, show us one video of him saying that. And then Daniel goes and in the private chat sends me a link to a video. He sent me a link to a video of the statement by Mitch McConnell saying that you can't leave because of women's rights, and moreover, I look at that and I'm like, oh, okay, we'll watch this. It's 7 minutes long, and I've got the video up on the screen or I've got it right here right now, but I'm going to just briefly screen share over because it's funny what you're about to see. Okay. The count that made the video, and mind you, the video, it's his. It's actually his account, and he got upset that we talked about that being his account. Except the thing is, the profile picture of the YouTube channel is the same as his.
Hold on. He's like, don't talk about his YouTube account. That's his stipulation. But also at the same time, he can like flaunt that in your face and then be like, you're not allowed to talk about the actual.
He kind of got forced into it because he was like,
well, he sent a video from his. We were kind of
saying that like the context has to be different.
He sent a video from his channel. And now he's upset that I talked about his channel when I told him that I wouldn't talk about social media on stream, but he sent it from his channel. Exactly. And so even if I didn't mention that was his YouTube channel, it's his profile picture in the debate, same as on the channel.
Well, the funny thing is, I would never have known that was his channel. I don't think anyone would have, except he freaked out when you put the video that he sent you on there. He screen shared it like he wanted you to, and he's like, "Oh, you said you weren't gonna do this." It's like he
got so mad that I showed the video. It's like, but dude, you sent the link to that video. You could have sent that from any. You could have sent that from any source. You could have sent it from Richard Spencer. You could have sent it from Bosch. You sent it from your channel, and it turned out, by the way, in case you're wondering, well, did Mitch McConnell say that? He mentioned that women's rights would be hurt at about halfway through the video, as one sentence in a 7-minute speech on why leaving Afghanistan would hurt American security. Unbelievably.
It was literally what I predicted it would be when he told us that.
The title of the video. On his part. He titled the video, and by the way, it wasn't like original content. He had no commentary. All that this guy does on his channel is just takes clips from Fox News or takes clips from C-SPAN, uploads them to YouTube, and then gives like crazy titles for them. The title was Mitch McConnell says we can't leave Afghanistan because Afghan feminism. That was the title of the video, and it's like
amazing.
It was one.
So I think he's just editorializing it because he's biasing the viewer in how they're going to perceive the comments by essentially giving his little editorial thing in the title, and that's it.
Yeah, he also got really upset at the World War II analogies too.
Yeah, I tried to give him advice on that. I was like, man, if you're gonna do that with the title, your clickbait title of Mitch McConnell says we're fighting in Afghanistan for feminism or whatever it was, like, you just edit out. Why would you upload 7 minutes where he never mentions it, lists off a ton of other reasons why we're there,
Yeah,
Like,
would
why
think
would
that
you
if
not
you're
just
gonna do
clip
this
out
propaganda thing,
the like
you
the
would
7
clip it.
seconds?
You
Like,
would just
well,
clip the 7 seconds then at least. If he's
yeah, I
gonna do
was
it
like,
live.
dude, you're not even good at your propaganda, man. Like,
Uh, yeah, you know what? I've got one question just kind of before we end the debate. I guess I'm not sure we really got to this tonight, but Ray, do you think that like participation in a labor union should be voluntary, or do you think that you should be required to join a union when you say apply for a job in a company or something? That's the only thing that we didn't get to that I remember. Right.
I'm in favor of the voluntary method. There are
Okay.
severe downsides that come with the compelled joining issue. Look, I mean, compelling people to join can often result in people joining who either A, do not have an actual interest in doing union stuff, or B, are actually wreckers and who are going to just like make increasingly bad decisions or drag you in increasingly bad directions. And so I said at the beginning, that it's not about getting everyone to be a member of a union. It's just a matter of having just enough people in the union to actually incentivize the creation of the institutions to facilitate negotiations. That doesn't necessarily require there to be 100% membership. You could probably get that at 49, 50, 51% maybe. Who knows? But no, I would not be in favor of the idea of compelling people to join unions. Because I mean, you'd get 100% membership, but would it be functional? That's the question.
Yeah, because I've worked at a job before, you know, where you were required to join the union and everything, and it was a mess. Like, you know, it would be like, you know, it was not really a productive sort of thing, and it turned out that that place actually went under. So, you know,
you were required to join the union.
Oh yeah, no. In Canada, like there are unions where, like, if you apply for a job, like you register to be in the you're in the union basically. Like if you want to work there, yeah. So, like, you know,
I'm not even sure. I don't think that's a thing in America.
I'm pretty sure the schools are like that too, because I know we had somebody.
I've never been a teacher. I can't say that it's not for sure. All I can say is I've never worked at a job where that was a thing.
Oh, okay. Because like the big thing for me, and I mean, maybe this is more of a Canadian issue then, but I don't like that it's not voluntary. You know, that was always one of my issues with that. But you know. But
yeah, so you have to. I don't know. Does it work there? You have to pay dues.
You have to pay dues. You have to pay dues, and there's a lot of just like politics stuff that comes into it as well, right?
Yeah, there's American unions that have become, at least in the past. I'm not sure how it is now. I know in the past, they became very political, and there was, as you guys talked about, there's issues with corruption and other things going into when it becomes a big organization like they often do, it's other things creep in.
Yeah. This is what Wyatt's saying in the chat. In Canada, if a private union votes to make itself public and mandatory, then it has to, even if it only represented like 25% of an entire workforce. So, and he also says the unions in Canada are NDP front groups. They do millions in political advertising for the NDP. Like that's one of the things, is that there's a really close and intricate relationship between some of the big unions in Canada and the NDP as a party. And that's one other thing that I guess that's a good point that Wyatt brings up there. I would say alongside impartial negotiation processes, you'd have to do something where it can't be a blatantly sort of politically motivated thing. And like, I mean, maybe, but it can't be mandatory, you know, like, because you can't require a worker that might be conservative to pay dues into a union that's going to take some of their dues money and give it to a political party that they disagree with.
Exactly. That should be avoided. I mean, and the thing is, there are some people on the left who don't like it when I point this out the same way as well. But I mean, think about it this way. If business federations behave the same way, I think everyone would be up in arms. Like, imagine if you had the business federation, and in order for your business, be it small, medium, or large, to be represented by the federation, one, imagine if joining the federation was mandatory. And then two, imagine if by joining the federation, all of your money goes to Stephen Harper.
Well, that's exactly,
I mean, they would be really, really upset about that, I'm sure. Right. So, I mean, it's one of those things where, like, yeah, if it's something that is not allowed for business federations to do, then unions should consider not doing those things themselves also.
Yeah. I mean, and there's also just like some of the some of just the aesthetics and everything of it, you know, is like, you know, it's a lot of like socialist imagery and whatnot, even if it's not inherently socialist in and of itself. And I just, there's something about that, like just making it mandatory that just, I think rubs a lot of people the wrong way in general. But we've had agreement here tonight on a lot of that. So I don't really have anything else to add then, but I thought it was a good point from Wyatt. So thanks to Wyatt for bringing that up. So, but yeah, this has been, like I said, a pretty cordial debate, pretty friendly debate compared to last night. Like, if people are disappointed that there was no blood sports tonight, you have 3 hours of blood sports last night. Almost 3.5 hours of blood sports. You can go and check that out, and that'll satisfy you to your heart's content for blood sports. I mean, that went on longer in terms of just the heated, intense portion than, I mean, a lot of actual debates in their fullness go. So
yeah, I mean, if we tried really hard, we could probably instigate some blood sports here.
Oh yeah. Well, okay.
Just call Ray a fascist again, Kevin.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Or we could end on a positive note. You know, either way.
Yeah.
I think we've had I think we've had pretty like tranquil debates so far, mostly because like the things we've chosen to debate each other on are stuff where like we're not in like mostly disagreement with each other on. So like, I don't know, if we want like a proper war, we need to like find a topic where we are actually in like total disagreement somehow.
Well, okay, maybe one that we are kind of in quite a bit of disagreement on, that which we already kind of debated in the past before. We don't have to do tonight. But
you want to talk about this off air, maybe?
Yeah, maybe off air.
Yeah,
that's probably a better.
If we start deciding topics on air, we'll be giving away to the audience, and then they'll like find ways to hype it or something before it even happens.
Yeah, that's true. Fight, that kind of thing. So
yeah.
So yeah, thanks to everybody for watching. If you'd like to debate me, feel free to send me a debate request over on Twitter. Tonight, I was actually kind of the challenger because we had talked about this stuff in a previous stream. I was like, oh, that'd be an interesting topic to debate about. So that doesn't usually happen, though, but I've become more of a debate me bro as I've gotten more into debating and everything. You could go and check out Ray Murasame over on Twitter. Your handle is just at Ray Murasame.
Yeah,
you can find you can find Henry at American Madhouse with no A, so American Madhouse. So that's about everything. Was there anything you wanted to close with, Henry?
Not really. Have a great night, guys.
Take care, everybody.
Okay, see you.